Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving through the desert late at night. It was one of those long stretches of road that felt like it went on forever. No lights, no towns, just emptiness. I had been on the road for hours, trying to get to a motel before it got too late. The air was still and heavy, the kind of silence that made everything around feel even more isolated. I was halfway through a stretch of highway with nothing but sand and darkness on either side. The radio was just static, so I had turned it off a while back, leaving only the hum of the engine and the faint sound of the tires on the road to keep me company. It felt peaceful at first, but after a while, the loneliness of the road started to creep in. There wasn't another car in sight for miles, and I started to feel that strange kind of unease that comes with being completely alone. That was when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was probably just someone else traveling late like me. But the truck didn't pass. It stayed behind me, close enough that I could see the shape of it in the dark. I sped up a little, just to see if they'd go around, but they didn't. They kept the same distance, right behind me. I started to feel uneasy. I slowed down again, just a little, and the truck slowed down too. That was when I really started to get nervous. It was one thing for someone to follow close for a few minutes, but this was different. Whoever was driving wasn't trying to pass. They were just staying there, in the dark, keeping the same pace. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, trying to make out who was behind the wheel, but the lights from the truck were too bright. All I could see was the outline of the truck's front, big and heavy, almost like a shadow. I started to feel a knot in my stomach, and my mind raced with thoughts I tried to push away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the driver just didn't want to pass because the road was too narrow. But I knew something was off. After another mile or so, I decided to pull over and let them pass. There was no reason for them to stay behind me like that. I put my blinker on, slowing down and easing onto the shoulder. I expected the truck to fly past me as soon as I got out of the way, but it didn't. It stopped. The truck just sat there on the road behind me, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I waited, my heart beating fast in my chest. Why wasn't it moving? I thought maybe they had car trouble, or maybe they were going to pull over too, but no one got out. The truck just idled there, the engine low and rumbling, waiting like I was. I sat there for a minute, staring into the mirror, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My first thought was to get out, confront whoever was behind me, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't normal. This wasn't normal. I decided to get back on the road, hoping the truck would just leave me alone if I kept driving. I put the car in drive, my foot heavy on the gas, and merged back onto the highway. I didn't look back at first, too focused on trying to put as much distance between me and that truck as possible. But after a minute, I glanced in the mirror. The truck was still there. I felt the panic rising in my chest. No matter how fast I went, the truck kept pace with me, its headlights looming closer. It wasn't about getting around me anymore. They were following me. I pressed the gas harder, my car speeding down the empty road, the speedometer climbing. The truck stayed right behind me, not letting up. I could hear the engine growling in the distance, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone on this road anymore. I started to scan the road for an exit, a rest stop, anything where I could pull off and maybe find someone. But there was nothing. Just more empty highway and desert, no signs, no lights. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call for help, No signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Then, the truck did something that made my blood run cold. It swerved toward me, just enough to make my car shake from the air pressure, like it was trying to run me off the road. I swerved back into my lane, my heart pounding. I realized then that this wasn't an accident. They were playing a game with me. I glanced back at the truck, trying to see the driver again, but all I could make out was a figure, a dark silhouette behind the wheel, still grinning its headlights at me like some kind of predator. They sped up, pulling closer, the front of the truck practically touching my bumper now. My mind raced with ways to get out of this. If I pulled over again, they'd just stop too. If I sped up, they'd match my speed. I was trapped, with no one else around, just me and this stranger. I tried slowing down, hoping maybe they'd get bored, but it only seemed to make them angrier. The truck honked loudly, blaring through the still night, and swerved again, closer this time. My car jolted to the side, tires skidding for a second before I got control again. They weren't just playing anymore. They were trying to push me off the road. I pushed the gas pedal down as far as it would go, my car roaring down the road. I couldn't think straight. I just needed to get away. But the truck was relentless. It followed me, matching my speed, keeping just close enough to remind me they were there, in control. The road ahead stretched out endlessly. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. My car wasn't built for speed, and I could feel it starting to strain under the pressure. The truck, though, didn't seem to have any trouble keeping up. I spotted something up ahead, a turn-off, just a small dirt road leading off into the desert. I didn't have time to think about it. I swerved onto it, my tires kicking up dust as I veered off the main road. I hoped maybe the truck wouldn't follow, that they'd stick to the highway. But no! I heard the roar of the engine behind me, louder now as the truck barreled onto the dirt road after me. I drove blindly, the dust clouding my vision. I couldn't see anything but the headlights in the rearview mirror. The road was rough, the car bouncing and rattling as I sped through the desert. The truck was getting closer again. I could feel it. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The road ahead was getting rougher, the car shaking violently with each bump. And then, out of nowhere, the road just ended. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt in the dirt. I looked up, my heart pounding, and saw a cliff, just a few feet ahead. The truck stopped too, just a few yards behind me. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the ticking of my engine, cooling down from the strain. The truck's headlights bathed my car in an eerie glow, and I could see the silhouette of the driver inside, still watching me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was trapped, nowhere to go but over the edge. The driver seemed to know that. They just sat there, waiting, like they were enjoying the moment. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with panic. I couldn't just sit there, but I couldn't drive forward either. I was stuck. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the truck's engine revved again. I braced myself, expecting them to ram me over the edge, but instead, they just reversed. Slowly, they backed away, the headlights growing dimmer as they disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, too scared to move, too scared to believe it was over. I waited until the dust had settled, until the silence of the desert returned. Finally, I turned the car around and drove back to the main road, my heart still racing, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't see the truck again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching me, waiting for their next game. I decided to rent a cabin in the mountains for a few days, to clear my head. I'd been feeling overwhelmed by work and just life in general, so some time alone seemed like a good idea. The cabin was pretty remote, about an hour from the nearest town, surrounded by trees and nothing else. It was small but cozy, wooden walls, a fireplace, and a big window that looked out into the woods. I liked the isolation. It felt like I could breathe out there, away from the noise of the city. The first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon reading by the window, the silence of the forest relaxing. I didn't see anyone else around, and I kind of liked that. It felt like the whole world was just me and the trees. When night fell, I lit the fireplace and curled up in bed. The sound of the fire crackling was the only thing I heard as I drifted off to sleep. The second night was different. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black in the cabin, except for the faint glow of the dying fire. At first, I didn't know why I was awake, but then I heard footsteps. Soft, steady footsteps just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it must be an animal. I'd seen deer and heard some other creatures rustling around during the day, so it wasn't crazy to think something was wandering around out there. But as I lay there, listening, something about the sound made me uneasy. It was too regular, too deliberate. Not like the skittering of a deer or the shuffle of a small animal. These were slow, heavy footsteps, like someone was walking, taking their time. I sat up in bed, my heart beating faster now. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the isolation messing with my head. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin. I could hear them moving, first near the front door, then around to the side, then the back. It was like someone or something was walking around, checking the place out. I got out of bed and crept toward the window, trying to be as quiet as possible. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outline of the trees outside, casting shadows on the ground. I pressed my face close to the glass, looking out, but I didn't see anyone. Just the empty woods. The footsteps had stopped by then, and I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging up the glass, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe it really was an animal. Maybe it had just wandered off. But then I saw them. Footprints. Fresh, clear footprints in the dirt, just below the window. They weren't there before. They circled the cabin, just like I'd heard. My stomach twisted into a knot as I realized I was looking at human footprints, not animal. Someone had been walking around the cabin in the middle of the night. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but when I picked it up, I saw that there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was too far out, too deep in the woods. I was on my own. I stood in the middle of the cabin, trying to decide what to do. Should I stay inside? Go out and check? Every instinct in me was screaming to stay put, to lock the doors and wait until morning. But I also couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like whoever had been out there might still be around, waiting. The footsteps hadn't started up again, and after a few minutes, I started to calm down. Maybe they were gone. Maybe it was some random hiker who'd gotten lost. That was possible, right? I told myself it was nothing, just some harmless wanderer who had passed by. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept listening, waiting for the footsteps to return, but they didn't. The cabin was silent again, and eventually exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up, it was morning, and the sun was streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought maybe I dreamed the whole thing. But when I stepped outside, the footprints were still there. They were clearer in the daylight, and I could see exactly how they circled the cabin, over and over. They stopped at the front door, and for the first time, I noticed something else, handprints. Faint smudges on the glass of the door, like someone had pressed their palms against it, watching from the outside. I felt sick. Whoever it was hadn't just walked around, they'd tried to look in. They'd been close enough to touch the door to see inside. I thought about the way I'd stood at the window, looking out. Had they been watching me? I didn't want to stay another night. I packed up my things quickly, throwing them into my bag without caring if I was being neat. The whole time, I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see someone standing there. My car was parked a short walk from the cabin, just down a dirt path. As I stepped outside, the silence of the woods felt different, heavy, like the trees were watching me, like the whole forest was waiting. I hurried to the car, my bag slung over my shoulder, my keys clutched in my hand. I didn't even bother locking the cabin behind me. I just wanted to get out of there. But when I got to the car, I stopped. Something was wrong. The driver's side door was slightly open, just enough for me to notice. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure I'd locked the car when I arrived, but now the door was cracked, like someone had been inside. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Had they broken in? Were they still here? I didn't want to open the door, but I had to. I needed to see if anything was missing. Slowly, I pulled the door open, bracing myself for what I might find. The car looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place at first. But then I saw it, a piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting on the driver's seat. I hadn't put it there. My hand shook as I reached for it, unfolding it slowly. There was only one word written on it, in neat, careful handwriting. Why? That was all it said. Just one word, scrawled in black ink. I stared at it, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of it. Why what? Why had I come here? Why was I leaving? I didn't wait to find out. I threw the note on the ground, jumped into the car, and slammed the door shut. My hands were trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, dirt and gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, about an hour away. My heart didn't stop racing until I was surrounded by people again, by the noise and safety of civilization. I don't know who was out there that night, or why they were watching me. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't bring myself to even look at it online again. When I moved into the farmhouse, I thought it would be a fresh start. It was an old place, isolated in the middle of fields and woods, exactly what I was looking for. I'd been living in the city for too long and needed the quiet. The house was a bit run down, but that didn't bother me. I figured I could fix it up over time. At first, everything was fine. The air was fresh, the land stretched out in every direction, and there wasn't a sound except for the occasional rustling of trees or birds. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and I liked the idea of being on my own for a while, with no one around to bother me. Just me and the house. It was maybe a week after I'd moved in when I met him. The farmer. I was out in the yard, fixing a fence that had fallen apart, when I saw him coming up the dirt road. He was tall, probably in his 60s, wearing overalls and a weathered old hat. He waved as he approached, and I waved back, assuming he was just being friendly. "You the new owner?" he asked, stopping a few feet away from me. His voice was rough, like he'd been smoking all his life. "Yeah, I just moved in," I said. He nodded, looking around like he was taking in the place for the first time, though I could tell he was familiar with it. "This place been empty a long time," he said. "Not many people come out this way." I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured he was a local, curious about the new guy. We talked for a few minutes, mostly him asking about where I was from, what I planned to do with the house. His questions were a bit more personal than I expected, but I chalked it up to small-town friendliness. Before he left, he said, "If you need anything, I'm just down the road. Name's Harris." I thanked him and watched as he walked back down the road, disappearing around the bend. It seemed like a harmless visit, but there was something about the way he looked at me, the way his eyes stayed on me a little too long, that made me uneasy. But I pushed the feeling aside. Over the next few days, I kept busy fixing up the house. The place was old, creaky, but I liked it. It was quiet, and the silence was good for me. Then, about 4 days after that first visit, Harris showed up again. This time, he didn't wave or smile when he approached. "You been keeping busy?" he asked, without any greeting. "Yeah," I said, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "Plenty to do around here." He nodded, looking around again, his eyes scanning the house, the fields, like he was inspecting it. "You seen anything strange around here?" he asked suddenly. I frowned, caught off guard by the question. "Strange? Like what?" "Just strange things," he said, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear, but we were alone. "This land's been here a long time. Lot of history." I didn't know what to say, so I just shook my head. "No, nothing strange. It's pretty quiet." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me with those dark eyes. Then he nodded again and turned to leave. "You take care now," he said over his shoulder. The visits became more frequent after that. Every couple of days, Harris would show up, asking the same sort of questions: what I was doing, if I'd seen anything unusual, if I heard anything during the night. I always told him no, but each time he came, I felt more uneasy. His questions got more personal, too. He started asking about my family, if anyone would be visiting, if I ever went into town. "Why are you so interested?" I asked one day, trying to keep my voice casual, but I was getting frustrated. He was coming by too often, asking too many questions. "Just looking out for you," he said with a smile, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. One evening, about a month after I'd moved in, I came home from a trip to the nearest town. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and as I pulled up to the house, I saw something on the doorstep. It was a small, rusty padlock sitting on top of a folded piece of paper. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The note was scrawled in shaky handwriting: "You might need this soon." I looked around, but the road was empty, no sign of anyone. I knew it was Harris. I hadn't seen him that day, but I could feel it. I stuffed the note in my pocket, locked the door behind me, and checked all the windows. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to. Like I wasn't safe anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump: the creak of the house settling, the wind rustling the trees. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft but deliberate. I lay in bed, listening, too scared to move. The sound circled the house, like someone was walking slowly around the perimeter, checking the windows, the doors. I held my breath, waiting for the footsteps to stop, but they didn't. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound faded. I got up, my legs shaking, and checked the windows again. There was nothing outside, just the empty yard and the trees beyond. But I knew someone had been there. The next morning, I found more footprints in the dirt around the house. They weren't mine. They were too big, and they led from the front door to the back, then around the side, as if someone had been casing the place. I drove into town that day, thinking I could get some advice, maybe talk to the sheriff. But when I got to the station, the man behind the desk just shrugged. "Harris is an old-timer," he said. "He's been around here forever. probably just bored, trying to make conversation. It didn't feel like that to me. It felt like something else. That night, the footsteps came again. Louder this time. Closer. I locked the doors, barricaded the windows, but I could still hear them, circling the house like they were waiting for me to come out. I knew it was Harris. It had to be. He'd been watching me, waiting for something. But for what? The next day, I found another note, this one pinned to the front door with a rusty nail, lock up. It's coming. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in the house, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't want to stay, but I didn't know where else to go. I'd moved out here for peace, and now I was living in fear. That evening, as the sun set, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, threw it in the car, and drove. I didn't care where I was going, as long as I got away from that place. As I drove down the dirt road, I saw him. Harris. Standing by the side of the road, watching me, that same eerie smile on his face. I sped up, not daring to look back. But I could feel his eyes on me, all the way down the road, until I was far enough away to breathe again. I haven't been back to that farmhouse since. I don't plan to. Something wasn't right about Harris, about that place. I don't know what he meant by it's coming, but I don't want to find out. I had been driving all day, crossing through a bunch of small towns, heading for the cabin my sister had lent me for a weekend away. It was supposed to be peaceful, but my car started making this weird rattling sound as soon as I got off the main road. I didn't want to take any chances, especially since I didn't know the area, so when I saw a little repair shop in this quiet, almost empty town, I pulled in. The sign said Ben's Auto Repair, and there was an old pickup truck parked outside. The place looked a bit run down, but there wasn't much else around, and the idea of getting stranded with a broken car made me anxious. The bell on the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I saw the mechanic behind the counter. He was an older man, greasy hands, coveralls that were way past their prime, and a thick layer of stubble on his face. "Car trouble?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag and looking me over. "Yeah, it's making a weird noise. Kind of a rattling when I drive." "I'm not sure what it is," I told him. He nodded and followed me outside to the car. He bent down, looking under the hood, tapping a few parts here and there, not really saying anything. After a few minutes, he straightened up and wiped his hands again. "Hard to say just looking at it," he muttered. "But I think I'll need to keep it overnight. Could be something with the engine, might be the transmission, not sure yet." I hesitated. I wasn't planning on staying in town, just passing through. "How long will it take to fix?" "Depends on what I find," he said, scratching at his stubble. "But I won't know until I can get in there. I'll need to keep it overnight for sure." I didn't really have much choice. The idea of driving on with a potentially serious issue wasn't worth it. "All right," I said. "I'll come back in the morning." "There's a motel a couple streets down," he said, pointing vaguely to the left. "Not much else to do here, so you might as well get comfortable." I nodded, grabbed my bag from the car, and started walking. The town was tiny, barely a few streets, and not many people around. The motel he mentioned was an old building with a neon sign that buzzed quietly in the afternoon heat. I checked in, and the clerk, a young woman who barely looked up from her phone, gave me a key without much conversation. The room was basic, clean enough, though the carpet was stained and the bedspread was worn thin. I figured it was just for one night, so it didn't bother me much. That night, I tried to relax, but the thought of my car sitting in that shop kept creeping into my mind. The whole place felt off. The motel, the town, the mechanic. Everything was just a little too quiet. But I pushed the thoughts away, reminding myself that it was probably just nerves. After all, I was in an unfamiliar place, and I was anxious about the car. I went to bed early and didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening to strange noises outside, though I couldn't tell if they were real or just my imagination. By morning, I was ready to get out of there and back on the road. I walked back to the shop as soon as it opened. The mechanic was already there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up when I came in, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. "Your car's ready," he said, too quickly. "Already? What was wrong with it?" I asked. "Nothing serious," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just a loose part under the hood. Tightened it up for you. Should be fine now." I looked at him, then glanced outside at my car. It was sitting in the exact same spot I'd left it in, and it didn't look like it had been moved or touched. The windows were covered in the same layer of dust. The tires hadn't even been rotated. I felt my stomach tighten, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I just wanted to leave. I paid him, though I noticed he didn't charge me much, just enough to cover what he claimed was basic labor. I thanked him and left. As I got into the car and started driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The car still made the same faint rattling sound, and I had a sinking suspicion that he hadn't done anything at all. It wasn't until I was a few miles out of town, back on the road, that I got the first message. My phone buzzed from the passenger seat, and I glanced over at the screen. It was an unknown number, but the message caught my eye immediately. "Nice blue jacket." I froze. I was wearing a blue jacket. I hadn't taken it off since I left the motel. My heart started pounding, but I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had seen me in town. Maybe it was a prank. A minute later, another message came in. "You left your bag in the back seat." I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly on the empty road. I looked into the back seat, and sure enough, my bag was lying there. I hadn't even noticed it when I got in. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone, staring at the screen. How could anyone know that? Another message, heading west. Huh? Long drive ahead. I felt sick. Someone was watching me. Someone knew exactly where I was, what I was doing. I looked around, but the road was empty. There were no other cars, no houses, just endless fields and sky. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone was sending me creepy messages? They'd probably just tell me to block the number. I tried that, but a minute later, another message came through from a different number. "Did you sleep well last night?" I threw my phone onto the passenger seat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't go back to that town. I couldn't drive to the cabin either. I didn't know what to do. The messages kept coming, each one more personal than the last. They described my every move, my every stop. Whoever it was, they were watching me, following me. By the time I reached the nearest city, I was a wreck. I parked in a busy lot, surrounded by people, hoping that the crowd would make me feel safer. But the messages didn't stop. "Nice parking job. Look behind you." I turned around so fast my vision blurred, but there was no one there. Just people walking by, oblivious. I grabbed my phone and rushed into the nearest store, my hands shaking as I dialed the number for the police. When they arrived, I showed them the messages, explained what had happened. They took a report, but they didn't seem too concerned. They told me it was probably some prank, maybe someone from the town trying to scare me. They offered to trace the number, but I could tell they didn't think it would lead anywhere. I changed my number after that, bought a new phone, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every time I get in my car, I think about that mechanic, about how my car never moved, about how he knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I still don't know who sent the messages, or why, but I've never gone back to that town. And I never will. I was on the road again for work, another long stretch of driving across states I'd never been to before. I was tired. The kind of tired that makes your head feel heavy, and your eyes feel like sandpaper. I didn't care much where I stayed, just needed somewhere to sleep, shower, and get back on the road. It was late, and I pulled into the first place I saw, a small, dingy motel off the highway. It didn't look like much. The neon sign was flickering, a few letters burned out. The parking lot had maybe 3 cars scattered around, and the whole place just looked worn. I parked, grabbed my bag from the back seat, and headed inside. The receptionist was sitting behind the counter, a guy probably in his late 40s, early 50s. He had this kind of greasy look to him, hair slicked back, shirt too tight across his stomach. He was reading a magazine, didn't even look up when I walked in. "Need a room," I said, my voice cracking a little from how dry my throat was. He grunted, still not looking up. After a second, he slid a sign-in sheet across the counter with a key attached. The kind that's still on a metal ring, like you don't see anymore. No key cards, no electronic locks, just an old-fashioned key. $40 for the night, he muttered. I signed the sheet, handed him the cash, and he finally looked up at me. His eyes were cold, flat, like he was sizing me up but didn't care enough to hide it. He held onto the key for a second before handing it over, his fingers brushing mine a little longer than they needed to. "Room 12. Down the hall to the left." I nodded, took the key, and walked toward the room. The hallway smelled like old carpet, that musty kind of scent you get in basements or places that haven't been aired out in a long time. The lights flickered, buzzing like a fly trapped in a jar. I found the room and unlocked the door. It wasn't much. A bed with a lumpy mattress, a small TV that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a bathroom that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in just as long. But it was quiet, and that's all I needed. I locked the door behind me, tossed my bag on the chair, and collapsed onto the bed. I was out within minutes, not even bothering to change out of my clothes. I don't know how long I slept, but something woke me up. It wasn't a sound, exactly. More like a feeling. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling for a minute, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner. My heart was beating a little faster than it should have been. I sat up, looked around the room. Everything seemed the same. But then I noticed the door. It was cracked open. Not wide, just enough that I could see the dim light from the hallway outside. I was sure I'd locked it. Positive. I stood up, went over to the door, and checked the lock. It was still turned, still in the locked position. I shut the door again, made sure it was secure this time, and went back to bed. I told myself maybe I hadn't locked it right the first time. Maybe I was just too tired and didn't close it all the way. That had to be it. The next morning, I left early, before sunrise. I had a long drive ahead of me, and I wanted to make some good time before stopping for breakfast. The receptionist was still there, sitting behind the counter, flipping through another magazine. His eyes followed me as I walked out the door. He didn't say anything, just watched me leave. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just bored. Maybe he did that with everyone. I was too focused on the road ahead to worry about it. I drove for most of the day, stopping only once to get gas and grab something to eat. By the time I got back to the motel, it was almost dark again. The place looked even more run down in the fading light, but I was too tired to care. I just wanted to sleep. When I got to my room, the door was cracked open again. My stomach dropped. I knew I'd locked it. I remembered checking it, making sure it was secure. There was no way it had just popped open on its own. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find someone inside, but the room was empty. Everything was exactly where I'd left it: my bag, the unmade bed, the towel I'd tossed over the chair. Nothing was missing, nothing seemed out of place, except for the door. I checked the lock again. Still turned, still in the locked position. But somehow, the door had opened. I didn't know what to think. Maybe the lock was broken, maybe it didn't hold right. That had to be it, I told myself. But still, I felt uneasy. I grabbed the chair and wedged it under the doorknob, just in case. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound had me on edge. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the air conditioner, even the distant sound of cars on the highway. I kept waiting for something to happen, for someone to try and open the door. But nothing did. The next morning, I packed up early, ready to get out of there. As I was leaving, the receptionist was standing by the door this time, leaning against the frame, watching me. His eyes followed me as I walked to my car, but he didn't say anything. As I opened the car door, I glanced back at the room, and my blood ran cold. The door was cracked open again. I stared at it, my mind racing. I had locked it. I knew I had. I'd even wedged the chair under the knob. There was no way the door could have opened on its own. But there it was, hanging open, just a few inches. I got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the motel was just a distant memory in my rearview mirror. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling of being watched, of someone following my every move. I don't know what happened in that motel. I don't know if the lock was broken, or if someone was coming into my room when I wasn't there. But I'll never forget the way the receptionist looked at me. Like he knew something I didn't. Like he was waiting for something to happen. I haven't stayed in a motel since. And I never will again. I had never been to a town like that before. Small, tucked away between highways and farmland. It didn't even show up on the maps until you were practically there. I was visiting my friend Jenny for the weekend. She had transferred schools and moved out to this place with her boyfriend. There wasn't much to do, she said, but they had a fair in the fall, and we figured it'd be fun. We went in the afternoon, me, Jenny, and her boyfriend Mike. The fair was your usual small-town setup, rides that looked like they'd break if you leaned on them too hard, booths selling funnel cakes and deep-fried everything, and kids running around with sticky fingers and cotton candy. It was loud, crowded, and smelled like sugar and grease. Not bad, but not the kind of place I'd usually go to. Still, it was something to do, and I was glad to spend time with Jenny again. We played some games, rode the Ferris wheel, took pictures. Everything was fine. Normal. We were laughing about some rigged game we'd just lost it when I had to use the bathroom. There was a portable one near the back of the fairgrounds, so I told Jenny and Mike I'd be right back and went over there. That's when things got weird. I remember standing in line for the bathroom, waiting behind some kids who were talking loudly. My phone buzzed in my pocket, so I pulled it out to check a message. After that, I don't know. I can't remember what happened next. It's like everything went blank. Like someone hit a switch in my brain and just turned off the lights. The next thing I remember, I was standing in a part of the fair I didn't recognize. It was dark by then. The lights from the rides were flashing, and the music was still playing, but I didn't see anyone I knew. I didn't know how I got there. It felt like I'd blinked and suddenly I was somewhere else. My legs were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I must have been gone for hours, but it felt like only a minute had passed. I tried to calm down, tell myself I was just tired or confused, but something was off. My head hurt, like I'd been hit or something, and my mouth was dry. I reached for my phone to call Jenny, but it was gone. My bag was still slung over my shoulder, but my phone wasn't in my pocket where I'd put it. Panic set in fast, and I started looking around for anyone who might have seen me. Eventually, I found Jenny and Mike near one of the food stands. They were both talking to someone from the fair, looking worried. When Jenny saw me, her face went white. She ran over, yelling something, but my ears were ringing too much to understand her at first. "What the hell happened to you?" she was shouting. "Where have you been?" I couldn't answer her. I didn't know. I told her I didn't remember, that I'd just gone to the bathroom and then nothing. Mike was looking at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. They said they'd been looking for me for hours, that they thought something had happened. Jenny was shaking, saying she was about to call the police. I told them I was fine, but I wasn't sure if that was true. We left the fair pretty quick after that. They didn't ask any more questions, but I could tell something was wrong. I felt off, disconnected from everything. My skin was tingling, and my head kept pounding like I'd been hit. When we got back to Jenny's apartment, she kept looking at me like I might disappear again if she blinked. I went to bed early, hoping I'd feel better in the morning. But when I got up, it wasn't better. It was worse. I found my phone on the table in the kitchen. Jenny had found it on the ground near the bathroom at the fair, she said. I was relieved at first until I unlocked it. There were videos on my phone that I didn't take. The first one was shaky, like whoever was holding it didn't know how to keep their hand steady. It showed me walking down a dark street, but not at the fair. This was somewhere else. I didn't recognize the road or the buildings. There were no cars, no lights, just the sound of my footsteps on gravel. I didn't seem to notice the camera, didn't look at it at all. Just kept walking, like I didn't know I was being filmed. The next video was worse. I was sitting on a bench, still in that strange place, staring straight ahead. My face looked blank, like I was there but not really there. My eyes were open, but I wasn't blinking. The camera got closer to my face, but I didn't react. I just sat there, staring at nothing. There were a few more videos like that. One showed me standing in a field, looking up at the sky. Another had me walking into a building, the door closing behind me. Every time, I was alone. Every time, I didn't seem to notice the camera at all. I couldn't remember any of it. I didn't know where these places were or why I'd gone there. It didn't make any sense. I showed the videos to Jenny. She watched them with her mouth hanging open, not saying a word until the last one played. Then she just stared at me, her face pale. "You didn't go anywhere last night, right? You stayed in your room the whole time?" I nodded. Of course I did. I hadn't left her place after we got back from the fair. Then how? She trailed off, shaking her head. This doesn't make sense. It didn't. None of it made sense. I tried to retrace my steps, to think of anything that could explain what happened. Maybe someone drugged me at the fair, But why would they take videos of me walking around like a zombie and then give my phone back? None of it added up. We thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I blacked out at a fair and woke up with weird videos on my phone? They wouldn't believe me. Hell, I didn't even believe it myself. The whole thing has been messing with my head ever since. I don't feel like myself anymore. Sometimes I catch myself spacing out, just staring at nothing for minutes at a time. I'll look at my reflection in the mirror, and for a split second, I don't recognize the person staring back at me. Jenny keeps asking if I'm okay, but I don't know how to answer her. I'm not okay. I don't think I've been okay since that night. I took the night shift at an old warehouse complex about 3 months ago. It's one of those places no one ever thinks about, just rows of empty buildings with cracked windows and rusted out doors. The company I work for handles security there, though I still don't really understand why. The place is completely abandoned. No one comes in or out except for me during my shift, but I guess they don't want people breaking in or kids messing around. It was a quiet job at first. Most nights I just sit in the small security office by the gate, drinking coffee and watching the monitors. There's a row of old cameras, black and white footage, nothing fancy. Most of them barely work, static covering the screens half the time, and the ones that do work show nothing but the same empty lots and crumbling buildings over and over again. I've walked the perimeter a few times during the night, just to stretch my legs, but I never saw anything. Then things started getting strange. It was small stuff at first. I come into the office at the start of my shift and find the chair pushed out from the desk, like someone had been sitting there. I figured maybe the day shift guy forgot to push it in, though he usually kept things tidy. Then, one night, I noticed my coffee mug had been moved. I always left it on the far left side of the desk, but when I came back from around, it was on the right. I thought maybe I was just tired, that I'd put it there without realizing. But the more I paid attention, the more things seemed off. My flashlight would be moved slightly from where I'd left it. Papers on the desk would be shifted around. The chair would be turned just a bit, like someone had sat in it while I was gone. I started double-checking everything before I left the room, making sure everything was in its place, but every time I came back, something had changed. After a week of this, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't enough to really freak me out yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been in the office when I wasn't there. I thought maybe it was the day shift guy messing with me, but he always denied it when I asked. Said he never touched anything. Then, about 2 weeks ago, I noticed something on the cameras. I was sitting in the office, staring at the monitors like usual. Most of them were just static or dark, but the one pointing at the main building entrance showed something. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. A figure. It moved quickly across the screen, almost too fast for me to see. I leaned in, trying to focus, but by the time I looked closer, it was gone. I watched the screen for another hour, but nothing happened. That night, after my shift, I decided to go through the footage from the past few days. The system doesn't record much, just a few hours at a time, so I figured it wouldn't take long. As I scrolled through the footage, I saw it again. The figure, moving in and out of the building, always wearing a mask and some kind of dark clothing. Every time it appeared, it would walk toward the main building, disappear into the shadows, and then come back out later. What freaked me out the most was the time it came in. It was always during my shift, and always when I wasn't looking. I never saw it in real time, only on the recordings. I checked the times, and each time I'd been out on my rounds or just away from the desk for a few minutes, that figure would appear. I started carrying my flashlight everywhere with me after that, and I stopped leaving the office for more than a few minutes at a time. I kept watching the cameras, trying to catch whoever it was in real time, but it was like they knew I was watching. They'd only show up on the recordings when I wasn't looking. Things got worse after that. One night, I found the door to the office slightly open when I came back from my rounds. I always lock it, always. But that night, it was ajar, like someone had been inside. When I stepped in, everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed my jacket on the floor, like it had been thrown off the chair. I checked the cameras right away, but as usual, I didn't see anything until I reviewed the footage later. The figure was there again. This time, it walked straight up to the office door. I watched as it reached into its coat and pulled out a key, unlocking the door like it had been doing it all along. It stepped inside, stayed there for a few minutes, and then left. I could see it was holding something as it left, but the image was too blurry to make out what it was. I didn't notice anything missing in the office, but just knowing that someone had been in there, moving my things, messing with me, it made my skin crawl. After that, I couldn't sleep during the day. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that figure. I started locking the door to my apartment, double-checking the windows, making sure no one could get in. Every night at work, I kept expecting to see that figure again, but it was like they were toying with me, waiting until I wasn't paying attention. Then, last night, everything came to a head. I was in the office, watching the monitors like usual. It was around 2 a.m., the time the figure usually showed up. I had my flashlight ready, and I was watching the monitor closest to the main entrance when I saw it. The figure. This time, it didn't move quickly like before. It walked slowly, almost like it knew I was watching. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out of the office, determined to catch whoever this was. I walked toward the main building, my heart pounding. The night was dead silent, and every step I took echoed in the empty lot. I reached the door and pushed it open, shining my light inside. The building was pitch black, except for the small beam of light from my flashlight. I stepped in, scanning the room for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep the flashlight steady. The sound was coming from deeper inside the building, from one of the back rooms. I took a step forward, then another, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. I reached the doorway to the back room and shined my light inside. There, standing in the middle of the room, was the figure. They were facing away from me, their head tilted down, their hands at their sides. I could see the mask they were wearing, some kind of old, dirty thing that looked like it had been pulled out of a trash heap. My heart was in my throat. I wanted to say something, to demand they show me who they were, but my voice caught in my throat. Then, slowly, the figure turned around. They didn't move like a normal person. It was slow, deliberate, like they were savoring every second. When they faced me, I saw the mask up close. It wasn't just dirty, it was cracked, like it had been broken and glued back together. Their eyes were hidden behind the cracks, but I could feel them staring at me, watching every move I made. I backed up slowly, trying to keep the flashlight steady. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I should run or try to confront them. But before I could decide, they started walking toward me. I turned and bolted out of the building, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back in the office with the door locked behind me. I sat there, shaking, trying to catch my breath, my flashlight still clutched in my hand. I looked at the monitors, half expecting to see the figure standing outside, but the cameras were all static. I didn't stay for the rest of my shift. I grabbed my keys, locked the office, and left. I don't know who that figure is or what they want, but I'm not going back to find out. I told my boss I quit, and I've been sleeping with the lights on ever since. It was around midnight when I got back to the parking garage. I had stayed out later than I planned, catching up with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. By the time I said goodbye and started walking to my car, the streets were nearly empty, and that usual comfort of the night just wasn't there. The garage was quiet, too. Most of the cars were gone, and the echoes of my footsteps bounced off the cold concrete walls. My car was parked near the far corner, where the lights flickered every now and then. I'd parked there because it was the only spot I found earlier, but now I regretted it. It felt too isolated, and that dim lighting made everything feel off. As I got closer to my car, I noticed a van parked next to it. It wasn't there when I'd arrived, and it was parked a little too close. That bothered me right away. I couldn't see inside the van, the windows were tinted, and the garage lighting wasn't great, but it just seemed out of place. There were plenty of open spaces around, so why park so close to my car? I paused for a second, standing a few steps away, thinking maybe I should just go back upstairs and wait. But I shook it off. I didn't want to be paranoid, and I just wanted to get home. I unlocked my car from a distance and walked quickly towards it. I kept looking at the van, but nothing seemed to happen. No sound, no movement. I told myself I was being silly. When I reached my car, I opened the door fast and slipped in. I locked the door the second I got in, just out of habit. It's something I always do, and thank God for that habit. I remember pulling the door closed and reaching for my seatbelt when I heard it. That distinct sound of a sliding door, a van door opening. It was close, way too close. I glanced to my right, and sure enough, the van door was open. I saw someone's leg stepping out, moving fast towards my car. My heart jumped into my throat. It wasn't a casual movement. It was quick, deliberate. Like whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't waste a second. My hands fumbled for the ignition. My fingers were shaking so much that I almost dropped the keys. I jammed them into the ignition, turned them as hard as I could, and prayed the engine would start. I kept glancing up, my eyes darting back and forth between the dashboard and the van. The figure was moving closer, and I could see them now, fully stepping out of the van, coming right at me. I don't even remember pulling out of the space. I just remember slamming my foot on the gas, the tires screeching against the concrete as I shot forward, trying to get away. My rearview mirror showed the person standing there, watching me as I sped off. They didn't chase me. They just stood there, watching. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes. I didn't see his face clearly, just a vague outline under the garage lights, but his body language said everything. He had been waiting. Waiting for someone like me. As I reached the exit ramp, I noticed my hands were still shaking on the wheel. I didn't look back again until I was halfway down the block. My breath was shallow, my whole body tense, and I couldn't stop glancing in my mirrors, terrified that the van would be behind me, following. But it wasn't. I kept driving for a while, taking random turns, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't go straight home. I was too rattled, too scared that somehow, whoever it was in that van knew more than I thought. Maybe they saw my license plate, maybe they could figure out where I lived. My thoughts were racing, and I was barely paying attention to the streets as I drove. After what felt like forever, I finally pulled over into a brightly lit gas station. I sat there in my car, breathing hard, my chest tight. I looked around, making sure there were people nearby, but still not getting out of my car. I didn't feel safe enough to even crack the window. What bothered me the most, what still bothers me now, was how close I came to not locking my door. If I had waited even a second longer, if I hadn't been quick enough, I don't know what would have happened. That van wasn't just parked there for no reason. They had a plan, and I was supposed to be part of it. I don't think I'll ever park in an underground garage again. Even now, every time I get into my car, I check my surroundings, lock my door immediately, and look twice at any van that's parked too close. I've played that night over in my head 100 times, and I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't reacted in time. But I'm not sure I want to know. I had been driving all day, making my way through the back roads of some small town I'd never heard of. I was trying to avoid the highways, taking the scenic route, hoping for some quiet time to clear my head. By the time I rolled into the town, the sun was already down, and I was starving. The place looked like the kind of town where everyone knew each other, small, quiet, with a single main street. A bar caught my eye, its neon sign flickering faintly in the night. I figured I could stop in, grab a drink, maybe something to eat, then be on my way. I parked the car a little ways down the street, got out, and stretched. The air was cooler than I expected, but it felt good after the long drive. As I walked toward the bar, I noticed how dead the town seemed. No cars passed by, no one walking on the streets. But I shrugged it off. It was late, after all. When I stepped inside, the place was pretty much what you'd expect. A few tables scattered around, some booths against the walls, a jukebox in the corner playing an old country song. A couple of guys sat at the bar, talking quietly, and the bartender was wiping down the counter, looking bored. It wasn't exactly busy, but it was warm, and it smelled like fried food and beer. Just what I needed. I took a seat at the bar, nodded at the bartender, and ordered a beer. He gave me a once-over, probably sizing me up as an out-of-towner, but didn't say much, just slid the drink over to me. I sipped it, letting the cool liquid calm me down after a long day of driving. Not long after, one of the guys sitting a few stools down struck up a conversation. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a worn-out cap and flannel shirt. "You passing through?" he asked, his voice friendly enough. "Yeah," I replied. "Just on a road trip, taking my time. Thought I'd stop in for a bit before getting back on the road." The man nodded, looking interested. "You don't see many folks coming through here. What brings you this way?" I shrugged. "Just trying to clear my head, I guess. Needed some space, you know?" He nodded again, like he understood exactly what I meant. His friend, sitting next to him, chimed in then. "Where are you from?" I hesitated for a second but figured it was harmless. "A few hours south. Got a place out there, nothing special." "Ah, city life," the first guy said, chuckling. "Bet it's a whole lot different than out here." The conversation started off normal, just small talk, the kind of stuff you expect when you're the outsider in a small town. But after a while, more people in the bar started paying attention. A couple more locals had come in, and I noticed them glancing over at me, listening in on the conversation. I wasn't too bothered at first. Small towns are like that. I figured everyone's curious when someone new shows up. But the questions started getting weird. "So, you married?" one of the guys asked, leaning in a little closer. I hadn't even seen him sit down. He looked like he'd just walked over from a table in the corner. "No," I said, taking a sip of my beer. "Not anymore." He nodded like he already knew that. "Divorced, huh?" I hadn't mentioned anything about being divorced, but I figured maybe he was just guessing. Yeah, something like that. Another guy, sitting a few stools down, laughed quietly. Tough break. Heard she took the house, too. My stomach twisted a little when he said that. There was no way he could know that. I hadn't told them anything about my ex, let alone the details of the divorce. I tried to keep my face neutral, but I could feel myself getting tense. Small world, the bartender said, coming back over. People talk, you know? I forced a smile, but something didn't feel right. Yeah, I guess so. I was ready to finish my drink and get out of there, but they weren't done yet. The first guy leaned in closer, lowering his voice. You still driving that old Chevy, huh? Surprised that thing's still running after all those miles. My blood went cold. My car was parked outside, out of sight from the windows. There was no way he could have seen it. I hadn't mentioned what kind of car I drove either. My mind raced, trying to figure out how they knew so much. I set my beer down, trying to keep calm. Yeah, I'd had it for a while. Another man, sitting at the table near the jukebox, joined in. Heard you got it fixed up last year, after that little accident on the highway. That must have cost you a pretty penny. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about the accident, and it hadn't been anything serious. Just a small fender bender on the highway, barely worth mentioning. But this guy knew, and he knew details. The repair, the cost, all of it. I looked around the bar, suddenly feeling trapped. The locals were all watching me now, their eyes cold, their smiles too wide. It was like they knew everything about me, things I hadn't shared with anyone, and they were enjoying watching me squirm. I cleared my throat, trying to play it off. Yeah, I got it fixed. No big deal. The guy next to me chuckled, like he knew I was lying. No big deal, huh? Didn't seem like that when you were fighting with the insurance company. That was it. I stood up, trying to keep my movements calm, but my heart was racing. I think I'm gonna head out, I said, reaching for my wallet. The bartender shook his head. No need. It's on the house tonight. I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to owe these people anything, but I didn't feel like I had a choice. I nodded, shoved my wallet back in my pocket, and headed for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pushed the door open, I could feel their eyes on my back. The air outside was colder now, and I hurried to my car, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. When I reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. I glanced around, half expecting to see one of them standing behind me, but the street was empty. I climbed in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine. The headlights lit up the street in front of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the shadows. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The bar door was still open, and I could see the locals standing there, watching me drive away, their faces shadowed under the flickering neon sign. I didn't stop driving until I was miles out of town, back on the empty highway. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced that one of them would be following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark road stretching out ahead of me. Even now, I can't figure out how they knew so much. I didn't tell them anything, but somehow, they knew everything. They knew things I hadn't even told my closest friends. It was like they had been watching me for years, waiting for the moment I'd walk into that bar. I've tried not to think about it since then, but every time I pass through a small town, I get that same uneasy feeling. I check the rearview mirror more often, and I never stop at places I don't know. I don't think I ever will again. I had always prided myself on being independent. I lived alone in a small apartment, and I loved the quiet. My days were filled with work and routine. I would wake up, go to the gym, head to my office, and come home to read or watch television. There was comfort in my predictability. That is, until the call started. At first, it was just a few late-night rings. I would wake up, groggy, and glance at my phone. No number showed on the screen, just unknown caller. I would ignore it and roll back over, thinking nothing of it. Everyone gets strange calls from time to time. However, the calls persisted, becoming a nightly occurrence. One night, I picked up the phone after the third ring. "Hello?" I asked, half asleep. There was silence on the other end. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice firmer this time. Still, nothing. I hung up, feeling a chill creeping down my spine. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, even from the other side of the line. The following night, the calls returned. I decided to ignore them again, but the silence felt heavy. It was not just the absence of words, it was an unsettling awareness. Somehow, I knew the caller was there, listening. After a week of these disturbing interruptions, I felt compelled to take action. I called my phone company during the day, hoping to get to the bottom of this. The customer service representative sounded bored but took my information and promised to investigate. After a few minutes on hold, they came back with news that I had not expected. "Ma'am, the calls are coming from a number registered to your own address," the representative said. I felt my heart drop. "What do you mean?" I asked, disbelief flooding my voice. "Your phone number is linked to a device registered at your residence," they continued. "You may want to check if someone else is using your line." I hung up, my mind racing. The thought of someone having access to my phone line made my stomach churn. I hurried home after work, checking every room in my apartment. I felt foolish searching for a hidden intruder, but the thought of someone being inside my home, watching me, made me sick. I even checked behind my curtains and in my closet, knowing full well that I lived alone. Days went by, and the calls continued. Each night, I would dread going to bed, listening for the phone to ring. I tried to convince myself it was all a coincidence, a glitch in the system. But deep down, I felt a sense of dread creeping closer, like a shadow stalking me. One night, I decided to do something different. I went to bed, set my phone to silent, and placed it face down on the nightstand. I would not let it control me any longer. I was exhausted, and sleep overtook me quickly. But then the ringing started. It was louder than usual, jolting me awake. My heart raced as I blinked in the darkness, reaching for my phone. I grabbed it and saw that it was now displaying the same unknown caller information. My skin crawled. I picked it up, ready to yell into the void, but before I could even speak, the ringing stopped. I stared at the screen, half expecting to see a message or something, but there was nothing. My breath was heavy as I tried to calm myself. I decided to get up and pour a glass of water. I could not shake the feeling that I was now alone. As I walked to the kitchen, the shadows in my apartment felt thicker. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own. I reached the kitchen, turned on the light, and poured my drink. As I took a sip, I heard a soft thud coming from the living room. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound had come from inside my apartment. I put the glass down and crept back into the living room, careful not to make a sound. I glanced around, scanning every corner, but I saw nothing. Everything was as it should be, yet my skin tingled with an awful awareness that something was off. Just then, my phone buzzed. I jumped, startled, and hurried back to my room. I picked it up and saw a text notification. It was from an unknown number, I opened it, and my heart sank. The message read, "I see you're still home alone." Panic surged through me. I stared at the screen, my breath coming in short gasps. How did they know? I turned to look at the window, my mind racing through every possibility. I felt vulnerable, exposed. I needed to act fast. I decided to call the police, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number. I explained everything, from the phone calls to the message I had just received. The operator assured me that they would send someone over, but it felt like an eternity before the knock on my door finally came. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood there, looking serious. I let them in and explained everything again, my voice shaky. They listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. As they looked around my apartment, I felt a small bit of relief. I was not alone anymore. They reviewed the situation and decided to check the area outside, just in case. I waited anxiously, pacing my living room as I replayed the events in my mind. Minutes felt like hours until one of the officers returned. "Ma'am, we didn't find anyone, but we will keep an eye on the area," he said. "You should consider changing your number and maybe even installing some security measures." I nodded, feeling overwhelmed by it all. The officers left, and I locked the door behind them. I thought about what they said. Changing my number felt like giving in, but I knew I had to do something. I could not live like this any longer. After a few days of restless sleep and constant vigilance, I finally called my phone company to change my number. They assured me it would be effective immediately. That evening, I received my final unknown call. It rang twice before I could answer, and I took a deep breath. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady. This time, there was silence on the other end. It was deafening, and my heart raced in anticipation. I waited, hoping they would respond. Nothing. The line went dead, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. I hung up and turned off my phone for the night. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. The darkness felt a little less suffocating now. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, hoping that this time I would sleep soundly. A few days later, I noticed a change in my life. I had a new phone number, and the calls had stopped. My mind felt clearer, and I slowly started to return to my routine. I felt like I could finally breathe again. I no longer felt like someone was watching me. One evening, as I returned home from work, I noticed something odd. There was a package on my doorstep. It was small and wrapped neatly, but it had no return address. I picked it up, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. Had someone sent me something? I opened the package cautiously, revealing a small, ornate box. I held it in my hands, unsure of what to do. My heart raced, and I felt the familiar tingle of fear creeping back in. I opened the box, and inside was a phone, my old phone. The one that had been plagued with those calls. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what this meant. My blood ran cold as I realized that I had not changed my number on that device. I was still being watched. I never thought a simple trip to the grocery store could lead to something so unsettling. It was a Tuesday, one of those gray afternoons when the sky looked like it might rain but didn't. I needed some essentials, just milk, bread, and a few other things. The store was small, the kind of place where you see familiar faces and nod at strangers. As I pushed my cart through the narrow aisles, I noticed a man standing a few feet away. He was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out jacket. At first, I thought nothing of it. He looked like someone who had just come in for a quick stop. But as I reached for a box of cereal, I caught him staring at me. It was odd, the way he held my gaze, as if he were trying to memorize my face. I turned away quickly, a bit uncomfortable. I finished my shopping, kept my head down, and paid at the register. When I walked out, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. People stare sometimes. It does not always mean something. The air felt heavy outside. I shrugged it off and headed to my car, parked a little further down the lot. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him again, standing by the entrance of the store. He was still watching. My heart raced a little, and I quickly turned the key in the ignition. Driving home, I tried to shake off the feeling. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting him to appear behind me. The streets were mostly empty, and I felt silly for being anxious over some guy. Still, I took the long way home, turning onto side streets and avoiding my usual route. Once home, I busied myself with dinner, but I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Yet, the image of his eyes fixed on me lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow creeping into my thoughts. I closed the curtains early that night, almost instinctively. The next day, I decided to put it behind me. I went to work and focused on my tasks. But as I stepped out for lunch, I spotted him again, across the street. I froze. There he was, standing near a lamppost, just staring. My stomach dropped. I hurried into the deli, hoping he wouldn't follow. I took my meal to go and left through a side exit, but my heart sank when I saw him again, now even closer, just watching. I thought of calling someone, maybe a friend, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I decided to avoid the area for a while. I went home, thinking that if I didn't go out, I wouldn't have to deal with him. The days went by, and I avoided going out as much as I could. I had groceries delivered, worked from home, and even skipped my regular jogs. It felt like a prison, but I convinced myself it was safer. Yet, every time I looked out the window, I expected to see him standing there, just outside my view, waiting. One afternoon, I had to venture out for some fresh air. I told myself I would only walk around the block. I stayed alert, scanning my surroundings. The street was quiet, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I felt a little better until I rounded a corner and saw him again, this time leaning against a wall, arms crossed. He looked different, more menacing, as if he had been waiting for me. I turned and walked fast, heart pounding. I did not want to show fear, but I could feel him behind me. I quickened my pace. I was almost running now, not daring to look back. I heard footsteps, matching mine, echoing down the empty street. I darted into a nearby cafe, hoping he would pass by. I sat at a table in the back, my breath shallow, trying to calm myself. I sipped my water, watching the door. Minutes felt like hours. I was trapped in that cafe, just waiting. The barista glanced at me, probably sensing something was off. I wanted to ask if I could use their phone, but I didn't know how to explain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw him through the window, pacing outside. He looked angry, scanning the street. I could not stay there. I needed to leave, but I also knew I had to be smart about it. I waited until he walked away down the street. When I slipped out the back door, I kept my head down and hurried in the opposite direction. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I turned into a side alley, hoping to lose him. I emerged onto a busier street, relieved to see more people around. For the next few days, I stayed inside, my anxiety building like a storm. I barely went to work. I called in sick, something I had never done before. I stayed glued to the window, always watching, always waiting for him to appear again. But he never did. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, I began to feel normal again. I forced myself to go out, trying to reclaim my routine. One afternoon, as I walked through a park, I thought I spotted him in the distance. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light. Time passed, and the fear gradually faded. I began to think I had imagined the whole thing, that maybe he had just been another odd character in a small town. But deep down, I knew that fear could linger, even when it was gone. I never saw him again. I resumed my life, although I still glanced over my shoulder more often than not. I learned to appreciate the small moments of safety, the mundane normalcy. I had escaped something that could have turned much darker. And for that, I was grateful. I had always wanted to escape the city for a while, just to breathe and find some quiet. So, when I discovered a quaint cottage for rent in the countryside, I booked it without hesitation. The pictures looked idyllic, with rolling hills and a small stream nearby. I imagined peaceful mornings with coffee and afternoons spent wandering. I was excited to finally take a break. When I arrived, the cottage was even more charming than I had expected. It had wooden beams and a fireplace that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The owner met me to hand over the keys. He was a friendly older man, his face lined with years of sun and smiles. He told me to make myself at home, that I could explore the grounds, and even showed me a little garden behind the cottage. Everything felt perfect. The first night was serene. I cooked dinner and sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of nature outside. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket and the quiet around me. The next day was much the same, filled with light and the fragrance of wildflowers. I went for a long walk, enjoying the stillness, taking pictures of everything that caught my eye. As the sun dipped low in the sky, I settled down again, feeling completely at peace. That night, however, things began to change. I woke up to an odd sound, a scratching noise coming from somewhere above. It was faint, but it pulled me from my sleep. I listened closely, trying to determine what it was. It sounded like something was moving, shifting, or perhaps even scraping against wood. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just the old house settling. But the sounds continued. They came and went, like whispers in the night. I tried to ignore it, turning over and burying my head in the pillow. Yet, the scratching persisted, and I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach. I looked at the clock. It was almost 3 in the morning. I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I hesitated before getting out of bed. The scratching had stopped, but I still felt uneasy. I decided I needed to ask the owner about it. Maybe there was some explanation. I drove to the small shop in the village where he worked. He was behind the counter, sorting through items. "Hello again," he said, smiling as I approached. "How was your first night?" I smiled back but could not hide the concern in my voice. "I heard some strange noises coming from the attic last night. Is there a way to check?" He frowned. "Attic? There is no attic in that cottage. Just the main floor and a small basement." I stared at him, puzzled. "No attic? But I heard something up there. It sounded like something was moving." He shrugged, a slight laugh escaping his lips. "Old houses make noises. It is probably just the wind or some critter outside. Do not worry about it." I wanted to feel reassured, but I did not. I thanked him and left the shop, feeling the unease grow inside me. That evening, I returned to the cottage. I tried to relax, reminding myself of the beauty of the countryside and the reason I had come. I cooked a simple meal and settled in front of the fire, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. As night fell, I heard the sounds again. The scratching, the scuffling. It felt closer this time. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, trying to summon courage. I moved from the living room toward the staircase, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. The sound seemed to come from above, more insistent now, almost angry. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer came, just a persistent scratching. I took a deep breath and ascended the steps slowly. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound amplifying my anxiety. When I reached the top, I found myself in a small hallway. There were two doors, one leading to a bedroom and the other to a bathroom. The scratching was louder now, coming from behind the door to the bedroom. I hesitated, my heart racing. I had to know. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the window covered with thick curtains. I flicked on the light and scanned the space. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The bed was neatly made, a small dresser against the wall. The scratching stopped. I stepped inside, feeling foolish. I was ready to convince myself it was just my imagination when I noticed something on the floor. A small trapdoor, barely noticeable, was hidden beneath the edge of the bed. My pulse quickened again. Crouching down, I gripped the handle and pulled. It creaked open, revealing a dark space below. The air that escaped was cool and stale. I hesitated, wondering if I should look inside. The sounds had stopped, but a part of me urged caution. I could feel something deep inside telling me not to go further. Instead, I decided to leave it alone and went back to the living room. I tried to watch television, but my mind kept drifting back to that trapdoor. What was down there? My curiosity gnawed at me, but fear held me back. I finally decided to sleep with the lights on, hoping for a peaceful rest. That night was different. I slept fitfully, constantly waking up to listen for any sounds. As morning light broke through the curtains, I felt a sense of relief. The scratching had not returned, but I still felt on edge. I packed my bags and decided to leave early. Before driving away, I stopped at the shop again. The owner was still there, sorting through items. I took a breath, gathering my thoughts. I heard strange noises last night. It felt like something was in the cottage. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You really must be imagining things." "I promise, there is nothing to worry about." I nodded, forcing a smile. I felt like I was the only one who had experienced this. I drove away, glancing back at the cottage one last time. The unease still lingered, but I was relieved to be leaving. When I reached home, I could finally relax. I promised myself I would never book a cottage again without thoroughly checking it out. As days passed, I put the experience behind me. Yet, late one night, while settling into bed, I heard a faint scratching noise outside my window. I sat straight up, heart racing. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a branch against the glass. I looked outside, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move. I turned on the light, breathing deeply. I had escaped the cottage, but something about that weekend stayed with me. I never forgot the trapdoor or the scratching. I realized that sometimes it is better not to know what lies beneath the surface. I moved to a new neighborhood last summer, looking for a fresh start after a tough year. The houses were charming, lined with trees, and there was a sense of community that I hoped would help me feel at home. I felt optimistic as I unloaded boxes from the moving truck, the sun shining brightly overhead. On my first evening, a neighbor came by. Her name was Linda, an older woman with a warm smile and a kind demeanor. She brought over a plate of cookies, freshly baked. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she exclaimed, her voice bright. I thanked her, happy to meet someone friendly. The cookies were delicious, and we chatted for a while. I felt good, thinking this might be the start of something nice. The next day, a man named Tom knocked on my door. He was in his 40s, tall, with a friendly face. He introduced himself and handed me a small potted plant. "It's a gift for you. Just a little something to brighten your home," he said. I appreciated the gesture, though it felt a bit odd. I had never received gifts from neighbors before. Over the next week, more neighbors came by. A couple down the street gave me a bottle of wine, while another family offered me homemade jam. I started to feel a little overwhelmed. Each gift was thoughtful, yet there was something about the frequency and personal nature of these gestures that made me uncomfortable. I had just moved in, and I hardly knew any of them. I tried to be polite and accept their kindness. Yet, I noticed how they seemed to know a bit too much about me. One neighbor, Sarah, asked about my job as if she had been following my social media. I had barely shared anything with anyone. I brushed it off, thinking it was just friendly curiosity. But the way they spoke made me uneasy. As the days passed, the gifts kept coming. A fruit basket appeared on my porch one morning. Another day, I found a handmade quilt draped over my mailbox. Each time I returned home, it felt like I was stepping into a strange world. Their gestures were meant to be warm, but it began to feel suffocating. One evening, as I sat on my porch, Tom came over again. He stood too close and asked me personal questions about my life. "Do you have any family nearby? Friends?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I answered politely but kept my distance. I just wanted to enjoy the quiet, but he did not seem to take the hint. That weekend, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I thought a stroll would help me feel more settled. As I walked through the neighborhood, I noticed Linda was in her garden. She waved and shouted, "Come over for a glass of lemonade." I hesitated but felt it would be rude to refuse. I walked over, thinking a quick chat would be harmless. When I arrived, she was preparing a large pitcher. Her yard was filled with colorful flowers, and it felt almost too perfect. As we sat on her porch, she asked me about my childhood. It was strange to talk about my past with someone I barely knew. As I finished my drink, I noticed how Linda seemed to hang onto my every word, her eyes wide with interest. "You know, you should come to our neighborhood barbecue next week," she suggested. "Everyone will be there. It will be fun." I smiled politely but did not commit. I wanted to step back from all of this. That night, I received a text from Tom. He asked if I would join him for coffee the next day. I had never given him my number. It sent a chill down my spine. I replied, saying I was busy, hoping he would understand. The next day, I found a note taped to my door from Sarah. "Missed you at the garden party yesterday. We will have to catch up soon." It felt invasive. I had no idea what garden party she was talking about. I considered packing my things and leaving, but I did not want to seem dramatic. As I tried to distance myself, the gifts only increased. A knitted scarf appeared on my porch. Another time, I found a box of chocolates left outside my door. Each time, I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. I tried to avoid them, but they would often stop by. It felt as if I was trapped in a bizarre social web. One afternoon, I returned home to find a small group of neighbors waiting on my porch. They were all smiles, holding plates of food. "Surprise!" they shouted. They had prepared a welcome feast. I stood there, stunned. I appreciated their intentions, but it felt overwhelming. I just wanted space, a moment to breathe. I attempted to express my gratitude, but also my need for privacy. "Thank you, everyone, but I think I need some time to settle in." "It is all very kind, but it is a bit much." They nodded, but I saw a flicker of disappointment in their eyes. I thought that would be enough, but the next day, I found Linda waiting outside my house, holding a casserole. "Just wanted to check on you," she said cheerfully. I felt trapped. I thanked her, taking the dish without looking her in the eyes. I returned inside, the casserole in my hands feeling like a weight. I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily. It was becoming clear to me that my attempts to withdraw only seemed to pull them closer. The following week, I went grocery shopping in another town, hoping for a little anonymity. As I pushed my cart through the aisles, I felt a sense of relief. It was a small escape from the constant reminders of my neighbors. But as I turned a corner, I nearly bumped into Tom. He grinned widely, as if he had been expecting me. "Fancy seeing you here. We should grab lunch sometime," he said, his tone cheerful. Panic rushed through me. "I really need to get going," I replied quickly. I could feel my heart pounding as I rushed past him, the feeling of being hunted creeping back. I had to get away from this all. That night, I sat in my living room, trying to gather my thoughts. I could not shake the feeling that the situation was escalating. My phone buzzed. It was a group message from my neighbors. They planned a big welcome party for me. The date was set for the following weekend. I felt my stomach drop. I spent the next few days preparing to escape. I packed essentials and arranged for a friend to help me move. I had to leave this place before it consumed me. I did not want to confront them. I wanted to slip away unnoticed. On the day of the party, I felt a mix of fear and relief as I loaded my car. I glanced at the house, expecting to see them gathering outside, but it was quiet. I drove away, feeling the weight lift with each mile. I did not look back. Once I reached my friend's place, I felt free again. The stress melted away as I settled in, knowing I had made the right choice. It was strange to leave so suddenly, but I knew I could not stay in that neighborhood. It was too much, too overwhelming. Eventually, I found a new apartment, far from those well-meaning but intrusive neighbors. I could breathe again, without the feeling of being watched. I learned that kindness can sometimes feel like a cage, and it was better to choose solitude than be surrounded by a crowd that would not let go. I often sought solace in the great outdoors. Hiking alone allowed me to escape the stresses of daily life and connect with nature. There was a particular trail I loved, one that wound through a forest, leading to breathtaking vistas. It was one of those days when the air was crisp and the sky clear. I felt invigorated as I set off early in the morning, eager for the adventure that lay ahead. The hike was uneventful at first, just the sounds of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves beneath my boots. I had been on the trail for a couple of hours when I decided to stray off the beaten path. I often enjoyed exploring areas less traveled. My instincts told me to be cautious, but the thrill of discovery tugged at me. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed something unusual in the distance. A structure caught my eye, partially obscured by the underbrush. My curiosity piqued. I approached it carefully, stepping over branches and ducking under low-hanging tree limbs. As I got closer, I realized it was a small, man-made shelter. It looked weathered, constructed from logs and covered with moss. I could not recall seeing anything like this on my previous hikes. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease. Who would build a shelter out here? And why? Nonetheless, I stepped closer to inspect it. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out some old gear and supplies strewn about. It looked like it had been used recently, but I couldn't tell by whom. I peered in, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and anxiety. I wanted to know more, but as I stepped closer, I heard voices in the distance. My pulse quickened as I realized that someone was coming. I looked around, trying to decide what to do. Panic began to set in. Should I run? Should I hide? The shelter was too small for me to conceal myself, and I could not go back the way I came without being seen. I opted to leave quietly, hoping to blend into the woods and escape unnoticed. I moved swiftly, trying to make as little noise as possible, but the leaves crunched beneath my feet. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I glanced back at the shelter just as two figures emerged from the trees. They were dressed in rugged outdoor clothing, carrying backpacks and gear. I ducked behind a large tree, hoping they wouldn't spot me. The two men began chatting animatedly as they approached the shelter, completely unaware of my presence. I strained to hear their conversation, but I could only make out bits and pieces. They spoke in low tones, their laughter echoing in the stillness. It felt oddly intimate, like I was intruding on a private moment. My heart raced as I realized that they were getting closer to where I was hiding. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, when one of the men abruptly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice sharp. The other man looked at him, puzzled. "Hear what?" "I don't know." "It sounded like footsteps," he said, glancing around. My blood ran cold. They could not have possibly heard me, could they? I remained frozen, pressing myself against the tree. The first man stepped closer to the tree where I hid, scanning the area. "It was probably nothing," the other man said dismissively. "Let's just check the shelter." The first man took a few more steps toward me. I held my breath, hoping he would move on. My mind raced, considering my options. I could wait for them to go inside and make a run for it, or I could risk confronting them. The first man took another step forward. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively backed away from the tree, trying to make my escape. But as I turned, I lost my footing on the uneven ground and stumbled. "Hey! Over here!" the first man shouted, pointing in my direction. I cursed under my breath and took off running deeper into the woods. I could hear their voices behind me, calling out, but I didn't dare look back. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, adrenaline surging through my veins. I heard the sound of branches snapping and footsteps crashing through the underbrush. They were right behind me. I had to think fast. I glanced around, searching for a place to hide. There was a thicket to my left, dense enough to conceal me if I could make it there. I veered toward it, pushing through the brambles and thorns. Once inside the thicket, I crouched down and tried to control my breathing. I could hear the men's voices growing closer, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. They were searching for me, and I had to stay quiet. "Where did he go?" one of them called out, sounding frustrated. "He couldn't have just vanished." "Check around the shelter again," the other replied. "He might have doubled back." I listened intently, straining to hear their footsteps as they moved past me. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. What did they want? Why were they out here in the middle of nowhere? I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe, as they moved around me. Their voices faded as they got farther away, and I slowly felt my panic begin to subside. After what felt like an eternity, I peered out from the thicket to see if it was safe. The men were nowhere in sight. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. I knew I could not stay there forever. I needed to get back to the trail, back to safety. I waited a few more moments before making my move. Carefully, I pushed through the underbrush and emerged on the other side. I felt exposed but knew I had to keep moving. I picked a direction and started walking, my heart still racing. As I followed the trail, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting around, but there was no sign of them. The trees closed in around me, and I felt the weight of the forest pressing down. Finally, I reached the main path, relief flooding through me. I took a moment to collect myself before heading back to the parking area. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. I felt a sense of urgency, knowing that I needed to get to my car before darkness set in completely. When I finally reached the parking lot, I jumped into my car, locking the doors behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the men lurking behind me, but I saw nothing. The air was still, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. I drove away, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The encounter haunted me for days. I had always loved the solitude of the woods, but now that love was tainted with fear. I couldn't shake the image of the shelter from my mind. What had I stumbled upon? I never returned to that trail again. The memory of that day lingered, a reminder of how quickly tranquility could turn into terror. I learned to respect the woods, but more importantly, I learned to trust my instincts. Sometimes, the wilderness holds secrets best left undiscovered. It was one of those nights that felt endless. The kind where the clock ticked away slowly, and all I wanted was to get home. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching out like a black ribbon beneath my car. I left the city behind, and now I was navigating through the dark, quiet countryside. As I approached a small gas station, the flickering lights illuminated the area, and I felt a small wave of relief. I pulled into the lot, glancing around. The place looked worn, but it was open. That was good enough for me. I stepped out of the car and noticed a figure standing in the window of the gas station. The attendant stared at me. His face was shadowed, but I could see he had a blank expression. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was late, and he was the only person there. I shook off the feeling and headed toward the pump. As I started pumping gas, I heard a crackling sound, and then a voice came through the intercom. It startled me. Nice night, isn't it? I glanced around, unsure if he was speaking to me. I replied cautiously, yes, it is. I could feel my heart rate increase. Something about his voice felt off, like he was trying too hard to sound friendly. Where are you headed? He asked. I hesitated. It was strange to be asked such a personal question by a stranger. Just heading home, I said, trying to keep my tone light. Home, he repeated. What a nice word. Do you live far from here? I felt uneasy, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I had learned to be cautious, especially at night and in unfamiliar places. Just a little bit away, I replied, keeping my answers vague. Are you alone? He continued, his voice dripping with curiosity. I swallowed hard. Yes, just me. I glanced back at my car, feeling a need to protect myself. I noticed the attendant was still watching me intently through the glass. Is your family waiting for you? He asked, and I felt a shiver. How did he know anything about my family? What about your parents? Are they excited to see you? I felt my stomach twist. They live far away, I said, my voice firmer now. I'm just going home. Just you, then. A woman alone at this hour. How brave, he said, almost mockingly. I finished pumping gas and stepped back from the pump, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. I needed to pay and get out of there. I glanced at my watch, feeling the urge to hurry. Be careful on the road. Not everyone is as friendly as me, he said. His voice had turned darker, more threatening. I walked toward the station's entrance, keeping my eyes on the door. I need to pay, I said, my voice sharper now. Sure. Come on in. I'll be waiting, he said, his tone suddenly cheerful again. I pushed the door open, feeling a rush of anxiety. The fluorescent lights flickered inside, and I glanced at the attendant. He stood behind the counter, his hands resting on it. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. I felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in around me. Just need to pay for the gas, I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course, he replied, his smile widening. How much did you pump? I told him the amount, and he rang it up slowly, as if savoring the moment. I could see him glancing at me, sizing me up. I fished my wallet out and handed him the cash, trying to avoid any further conversation. Do you travel this way often? He asked, as he counted the bills. Not really. Just passing through, I said. You know, it's strange to see a woman driving alone so late. I hope you know how to protect yourself, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. I took a step back, suddenly feeling very vulnerable. I'll be fine, I said, forcing a smile. He handed me the change, still holding on a moment too long. You should come back when the sun is up. It's a nice area during the day. Lots to see, he said, leaning forward on the counter. I nodded, my heart racing. Sure. Thanks, I said, taking my change and backing away. Drive safe. I'll be here, he said, and I could hear the strange tone in his voice again. I hurried back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got inside, I locked the doors immediately. I glanced back at the gas station, half expecting to see him standing at the window watching me leave. But the glass was dark now, and I could not see him. I started the engine, and as I backed out, I felt an overwhelming urge to get away. I pulled out onto the road, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the gas station fading into the distance, but a flicker of movement caught my eye. The attendant was standing outside, watching me drive away. I pressed down on the accelerator, putting as much distance between us as I could. The road stretched out ahead of me, and I focused on the path, determined to shake off the fear that clung to me. I could still hear his voice in my mind, asking questions that felt too personal, too invasive. It made me uneasy, like I was being stalked even when I was away from him. I drove for what felt like an eternity, the darkness surrounding me. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise felt amplified. I turned on the radio, trying to drown out my thoughts, but I could not shake the feeling that I was not truly alone. Finally, I reached a more populated area, the lights of the town illuminating the road ahead. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I knew I would never forget that encounter. It was a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, and how quickly a simple stop could turn into a nightmare. I promised myself to always be aware, to trust my instincts, and never let my guard down. The world could be a scary place, especially in the dark, and I had to stay vigilant. As I drove through the familiar streets, the comfort of home drew closer, but the memory of that night would stay with me long after the gas station lights faded from view. I had always found comfort in the quiet halls of my local library. The tall shelves lined with books, the smell of old paper, and the soft rustle of pages turning created a sanctuary where I could work undisturbed. I made it a habit to spend my afternoons there, immersed in research or simply enjoying the solitude. One Tuesday, I arrived as usual, the afternoon sun spilling through the large windows, casting warm light on the polished wooden tables. I settled into my favorite corner, a small table tucked away between two tall shelves. I opened my laptop and began my work, the world outside fading away. After a while, I noticed someone out of the corner of my eye. A man sat at a table across the room, his head tilted slightly. I felt his gaze on me, heavy and unsettling. He wore a dark jacket, and his hair was unkempt. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I shifted my focus back to the screen, but I could not shake the feeling that he was still watching. Every time I glanced up, there he was, eyes fixed on me. I felt the tension grow in my stomach. I decided to move, thinking perhaps a change of scenery would help me concentrate. I packed my things and chose a different spot, a table near the back where the light was dimmer. I thought that might deter him, but when I looked up again, he had followed. He was at a table not too far from me, the same vacant expression on his face. I could not understand why someone would want to stare at me like that. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. I opened my book, but the words blurred on the page. I glanced at the man once more, hoping he would look away, but he remained fixed on me. I could feel my heart racing. I decided to take a break, so I stood and walked toward the restroom, hoping to clear my mind. As I passed by him, I felt a chill. He did not move his gaze from me. It was as if he were trying to memorize every detail. I hurried into the restroom, splashing cold water on my face. I tried to shake off the fear, but it clung to me. When I returned, I saw that he had moved closer, now seated at a table only a few steps away. Panic gripped me. How could he move so quietly? I glanced around the library, looking for help. The few people present were engrossed in their own worlds, oblivious to what was happening. I wanted to scream, to shout that someone was watching me, but I felt paralyzed. I decided it was time to leave. I quickly gathered my things and headed for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes on me, almost burning into my back. The closer I got to the door, the more desperate I felt. Just as I reached the exit, I heard a soft voice behind me. "Are you leaving already?" I turned to find him standing just a few feet away. He was closer than I had expected, and I felt my breath catch. I need to go," I stammered, my mind racing. "Why don't you stay a little longer? It's nice here, isn't it?" His tone was unnervingly calm. I shook my head, backing away. "I have to go." He took a step toward me, and I could feel the adrenaline surging. I darted out of the library, the door slamming shut behind me. The cool air hit my face, and I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately. I looked through the window, half expecting him to be right there, but he was nowhere to be seen. I breathed a sigh of relief, but the terror still clung to me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The library faded into the distance, but I could not shake the feeling that he had been watching me long before I had noticed. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me and sat in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. I told myself it was probably just some strange coincidence. Maybe he was harmless, just someone with a peculiar habit. But as the hours passed, I found it hard to shake the image of his expression from my mind. That look of calm curiosity haunted me, and I could not bring myself to return to the library for days. The fear of encountering him again was too great. Eventually, I did go back, though I stayed near the front, close to the exit. I chose a table in view of the librarian, hoping to feel safer in numbers. But every time I heard footsteps behind me, my heart would race, and I would find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there. Weeks passed, and I never saw him again. I tried to convince myself I was being foolish, that he had simply been an odd man who had lost interest in me. Still, the memory lingered, a shadow in the back of my mind. I continued visiting the library, but I always stayed vigilant, always aware of the world around me. I learned to trust my instincts. If something felt off, I would not hesitate to leave. That experience taught me a valuable lesson about awareness and safety. Libraries are supposed to be places of refuge, but for me, they became a reminder of how quickly comfort could turn into fear. I kept my guard up, even in places where I once felt completely at ease. I never wanted to feel that vulnerable again. The office was quiet as I stayed late to finish some reports. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting a sterile glow on the desk cluttered with papers and a half-empty coffee cup. It was a Wednesday, and the rest of the staff had left hours ago. I preferred the silence, the calm that came with the absence of chatter and ringing phones. I was deeply focused on my work when I heard it. A sound came from the far end of the hallway, a soft thud followed by a rustling noise. I paused, straining to listen. Surely, I was the only one left in the building. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the building settling or the wind against the windows. I returned to my reports, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping in. Minutes passed, but the noise came again. This time, it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart began to race. I pushed my chair back and stood, glancing toward the door. The hallway lay in shadow, the flickering lights barely illuminating the path. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, each step echoing in the stillness. As I reached the end of the hallway, I found an empty office with the door slightly ajar. I leaned against the frame, peering inside. The room was dark, save for the slivers of light cutting through the blinds. Nothing seemed out of place. I pushed the door open a bit more and stepped inside. The room was quiet. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the desk or a chair. But it was empty. I turned back to leave, but something caught my eye. The window was wide open. I moved closer, peering out into the night. The view of the city was beautiful but unsettling. I felt exposed, standing there in the dark. I turned to leave when I noticed my purse was missing from my desk. I rushed back to my office, my pulse quickening. I searched the desk and the floor frantically. It was gone. I froze, panic washing over me. It had been right there. The realization hit me like a punch. Someone was in the building with me. I glanced back toward the empty office, the open window now seeming like an invitation to whoever had been lurking. I could not believe this was happening. I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed the security number for the building. "Security, how can I help you?" the voice on the other end said. "Hi, this is Lisa from the 4th floor. I think someone is in the building with me. I heard noises, and now my purse is missing." "Where are you now?" "I am in my office." "Stay there. I will send someone to check it out." "Please hurry," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder as I heard a creaking sound from the direction of the hallway. I waited, my hands trembling as I sat back down in my chair, phone still pressed to my ear. Each passing moment felt like an eternity. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to focus on the conversation with the security officer, but my mind raced with thoughts of who might be out there. "Are you still there?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can you hear anything?" I strained to listen. The sound of footsteps echoed again, but this time they were closer. "Yes, I think they are near," I said, my voice shaking. "Lock the door and stay quiet. Help is on the way." I hung up, locking the door and pushing a chair against it for extra security. I sat in the dark, my breath shallow and quick. I thought about my purse, the personal things inside. I felt so vulnerable, alone in this large building with a stranger who might have just been watching me. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear the creaking of the floorboards. I fought the urge to look out the window. It was a stupid idea. I forced myself to remain still, to breathe slowly, reminding myself that help was coming. I heard the footsteps stop outside my door. My heart raced as I held my breath, listening intently. There was silence for a moment, then a quiet knock. My blood ran cold. "Lisa?" It was the security guard. "Is it you?" I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, it is me. I need you to open the door." I hesitated, uncertain. "Can you give me a sign?" "Turn on the lights outside the office," he instructed. I reached for the light switch and flipped it on. The hallway lit up, and I could see the guard standing there, looking concerned. I opened the door slowly, letting him in. He looked around the office, checking every corner. "You're all right." "I was just doing a sweep of the floor." "You're the only one here." "What about my purse?" I asked, feeling a mix of relief and fear. "I will check the cameras to see if anyone has been in or out," he said, pulling out a small device to review the footage. I watched him intently, my heart still racing. After a few moments, he looked up. There was someone. They came in about half an hour ago through the back entrance. "I'm checking the footage to see if we can catch a clearer view." I felt a chill run through me. Someone had been in the building, watching me while I worked. "I didn't see anyone come in," I said. "It is a large building." "Sometimes people slip through unnoticed," he replied, focusing on the screen. He paused, his expression shifting. "Wait. Here." He pointed to the screen. I leaned in closer. There, on the grainy footage, was a figure moving through the hallway, but it was too dark to make out any details. I felt a knot in my stomach. The security guard continued watching the video, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'll call the police and report this. Do you have any idea what was in your purse?" I nodded, my mind racing. "Just some money, my ID, and my keys." "I will make sure to check the perimeter," he said, his voice steady. He moved quickly, speaking into his radio, but I felt frozen in place, my mind still grappling with the encounter. As he left the room, I took a deep breath. I had been lucky tonight. The situation could have turned out so much worse. I stood up, feeling a little more grounded now that I was not alone. Not long after, I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. The police arrived, and the guard returned to brief them on the situation. They questioned me briefly, asking for a description of my purse and the contents. The atmosphere lightened when they assured me that they would increase security in the building and that they would review the footage further. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing I was safe, at least for now. As I left the office building, the cool night air greeted me, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside. I knew I would never look at the quiet halls the same way again. The experience had shaken me, but it also reminded me to stay aware of my surroundings, even in places I had once considered safe. I drove home, feeling a sense of gratitude for my safety and the importance of vigilance. I would return to work, but I would always keep my guard up, no matter how quiet the world seemed. I had just finished a long week at work and decided to treat myself to a jog in the park. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind where the sun shone brightly and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. I arrived at the park feeling optimistic and ready to clear my mind. I started my routine, running along the familiar path, listening to the sound of my feet hitting the ground. The park was fairly busy that day, with families picnicking and kids playing on the swings. I felt comfortable, surrounded by people who were enjoying the day just like me. About 15 minutes into my run, I noticed someone in the distance. At first, I dismissed it as just another jogger, but as I glanced back, I saw the person was keeping pace with me. It was odd, they seemed to be a bit too far behind. I quickened my speed, thinking I could shake them off if they were trying to match my pace. But as I sped up, so did they. It was unnerving. I glanced back again and caught a glimpse of a tall figure, wearing a dark hoodie. I could not see their face, but I felt a chill run down my spine. The way they kept the same distance unnerved me. They did not seem to care about other runners or walkers. It was as if I was the only one on their mind. I turned my focus back to the path ahead, trying to ignore the feeling that was growing in the pit of my stomach. I could hear the faint sounds of laughter and joy around me, but the park began to feel less welcoming. I could not shake the sensation that I was being hunted. With each passing minute, I continued to notice the figure shadowing me. I told myself to remain calm. I was in a public place. I had nothing to fear, right? But the more I thought that, the more my heart raced. The park was large, but I had never felt so trapped. I decided to change my route. I veered off the main path, hoping to lose them in the winding trails surrounded by trees. As I took a sharp left, I could hear the footsteps behind me still pounding on the ground. It was as if they were always right there, a ghost that would not disappear. The trails became narrower, the sunlight barely reaching the ground through the thick canopy of leaves. I glanced back again, and the figure was closer now. I felt a jolt of fear grip me. They were not running hard, but they were moving steadily, closing the gap. I pushed myself harder, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I could not let them catch me. I rounded another corner, my breath coming in heavy gasps. I saw a small clearing ahead and sprinted toward it, hoping it might lead to an exit or a more populated area. As I reached the clearing, I turned back again, my chest heaving. The figure stopped at the edge of the trees. I could see their silhouette more clearly now, but their face remained hidden. They stood there, just watching me. I felt my heart pound loudly in my ears. My instinct screamed at me to move. In that moment, I made a split-second decision. I bolted toward the nearest path that led back to the park's entrance. The figure began to follow, but I was determined. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, willing my legs to move faster. As I neared the entrance, I could see more people up ahead. A group of joggers was stretching, a couple of families had set up picnics, and a few children were playing nearby. I could hear the laughter again, the sound washing over me like a wave of safety. I glanced back one last time. The figure was still there, but they had not followed me into the more populated area. Instead, they hung back at the tree line, watching from a distance. I felt an odd mix of fear and relief, knowing I was safe among the crowd. I continued running until I reached the parking lot. My car was parked under a tree, and I fumbled for my keys, glancing back at the entrance. The figure was gone. I could not see them anywhere. I took a deep breath, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I unlocked the car and got in, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I could not believe what had just happened. After a few minutes, I finally gathered the strength to drive away. The park that had once felt so inviting now seemed different, almost sinister. I drove home, keeping an eye on the road and the sidewalks, just to make sure no one was following me. That experience changed something in me. I had always enjoyed jogging alone, but now I made it a point to run with friends or during busier hours. I could not let fear dictate my life, but I knew better than to ignore my instincts. The world could be unpredictable, and sometimes it was best to remain vigilant. I was driving through this small town I'd never been to before. I wasn't planning on staying or anything, just passing through, but I saw this little church and felt like I should stop. I'd been going through a rough time, just needed some quiet or something familiar, I guess. The church wasn't big or fancy, just an old building with a sign out front that said Sunday service. It was starting soon, so I figured I'd go in. There weren't many cars in the lot, but I thought maybe it was just a small congregation. When I stepped inside, the place was quiet, almost too quiet. I'd expected to hear some music or people talking, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my shoes on the wooden floor. The whole church had this dim lighting, and the air smelled kind of stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. I saw about 15 or 20 people sitting in the pews, spread out, not really talking to each other. Nobody even looked up when I came in. I walked down the aisle and took a seat near the back, figured I'd just stay for a bit and then leave if I didn't feel comfortable. But then I started noticing the way people were acting. They weren't really praying or talking, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I kept glancing around, trying to catch someone's eye or give a little nod like you do, but every time I looked at someone, they'd just look away real fast. It felt weird, like they were purposely ignoring me. I thought about leaving right then, but the service was about to start, and I figured I'd just sit through a bit of it before heading out. When the pastor came out, he didn't really seem like any pastor I'd ever seen before. He didn't have the kind of welcoming look you'd expect. He was tall, thin, had this worn-out black suit on, and his face was pale, with these deep-set eyes that made it look like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't smile or greet the congregation, just stood up at the pulpit and started talking in this flat voice. There was no opening hymn or prayer, just him speaking. He was saying something about devotion, but it wasn't like any sermon I'd heard before. It felt off, like the words didn't fit right. It was hard to explain. He'd keep pausing, looking around the room like he was making sure everyone was paying attention. Every time he did, I felt this uneasy feeling in my stomach, like I shouldn't have come there at all. After about 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up quietly and started to walk toward the back. But before I could reach the doors, I noticed two men standing on either side of the exit. They hadn't been there when I came in, I was sure of it. They were big guys, both wearing these dark suits that looked almost identical. They were just standing there, staring straight ahead, but I could tell they were watching me. I tried to act casual and walked a little slower, not wanting to draw any attention to myself, but just as I was a few feet away from the doors, I heard the pastor's voice echo through the room. "Where are you going?" he asked. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence in a way that made everyone turn and look at me. I froze, not sure what to say. I was just stepping out for a moment, I replied, my voice sounding shaky even to me. The pastor didn't say anything else, but I noticed that everyone in the pews was now looking at me. Their expressions didn't look concerned or curious, they looked blank, like they were waiting for something. I took another step toward the door, but the two men moved closer, just enough that I knew they weren't going to let me through. I looked back toward the pastor, and he was just staring at me with that same flat expression, like he was studying me. "I think I need to leave," I said, louder this time, but nobody moved or said a word. It was like I was trapped in some kind of strange theater where everyone knew the script but me. The pastor took a step down from the pulpit, slowly walking toward me, his shoes clicking against the floor. "You should stay," he said. "We haven't even gotten to the important part yet." My heart was racing now. I glanced at the windows, thinking maybe I could get out that way, but they were high up and had thick glass. There wasn't a chance I could break through. I took another step back, and the two men at the door stepped closer, blocking my path completely. I was starting to panic, and I didn't care if it showed. "Let me out," I said, my voice breaking a little. "I'm not staying here." Nobody answered. The pastor stopped walking and just stood there, watching me, his head tilted slightly like he was amused or something. I didn't know what else to do, so I turned and ran up the aisle, trying to get to a side door I'd seen near the front. But as I reached for the handle, I felt someone grab my arm. I looked back, and one of the men in the suits had a tight grip on me, his face still expressionless. I pulled away as hard as I could and managed to break free, stumbling back into the aisle. The other people were starting to stand up now, moving slowly like they weren't in any hurry. They weren't saying anything, just closing in on me from all sides. I bolted toward the other side of the room, where there was another door. I didn't know where it led, but it was my only shot. I reached it and shoved it open, running into a narrow hallway lined with old wooden doors. It looked like some kind of storage area or offices. I didn't care. I just kept running, trying to find an exit. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't stop to see who it was, just ran faster, shoving open doors as I went, hoping one would lead outside. Most of them were just closets or small rooms, but finally, I found one that led to a back stairwell. I took the steps two at a time, almost tripping over myself, and when I got to the bottom, I saw a door leading outside. I pushed it open and stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I got in and locked the doors, looking back at the church. The pastor was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't come after me, didn't say anything, just stood there with that same blank expression. There were a few other people behind him, standing just inside the door, but none of them came outside. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I started the car and sped out of there, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out, but the way they looked at me, it was like they were all waiting for something, like I was supposed to be part of it, whatever it was. I still don't understand what was going on in there, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. All I know is that wasn't a church service. At least, not the kind I've ever been to. And whatever they were planning, I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out. I picked up my son from daycare every day at the same time. It had become a routine, one that I cherished. I loved seeing his little face light up when he spotted me through the playroom window. But one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. As I approached the daycare, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He was wearing a dark hoodie, and his hands were tucked deep into his pockets. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, but as I got closer, I felt a shiver run down my spine. He was staring at the children. They were all playing on the small jungle gym, laughing and climbing. But this man stood there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on them. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I wanted to look away, to pretend I had not seen him, but I could not. There was something unsettling about the way he watched, as if he was waiting for something. I walked into the daycare, trying to shake off the feeling. The cheerful sounds of children filled the air, but I couldn't concentrate on anything else. After I signed in, I approached the receptionist. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a bit shaky. "There is a man outside by the entrance. He looks odd. Shouldn't someone say something?" The receptionist looked up from her desk, her brow furrowing slightly. "A man? Are you sure? There shouldn't be anyone like that here." I pointed to the window. "He is right there. He has been watching the kids for a while now. It makes me uncomfortable." She stood up and went to the window, peering out. After a moment, she turned back to me, her expression unconvincing. "I don't see anyone. Maybe he was just passing by. I will keep an eye out." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Can you check with someone? It does not feel right." She nodded and walked toward the back office, leaving me standing by the entrance. I looked out again. The man was still there, but as I watched, he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. Our eyes met for a brief second. I felt my heart race. I quickly averted my gaze, focusing on the cheerful chatter of the children. Moments later, the daycare director joined the receptionist. They both stepped outside to confront the man. I could not hear what was said, but they were talking animatedly, pointing toward him. I felt a little relieved, but still anxious. After a minute or two, the director walked back in, her face calm. "He is gone," she said, glancing at me. "We spoke to him. He is just a passerby. Nothing to worry about." My unease only grew. He was staring at the kids. It did not feel normal. "I assure you," she replied, trying to sound comforting. "Everything is fine. We take the safety of our children very seriously." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I could see my son through the window, blissfully unaware of the world outside. After a few more minutes, the bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Parents began to arrive, and soon my son came bounding toward me, his little face lit with excitement. I scooped him up into my arms, trying to mask my worry. As we walked toward the parking lot, I kept glancing around. The man had disappeared, but I felt as though he could appear at any moment. I helped my son into his car seat, locking the doors as soon as I climbed into the driver's seat. The drive home was tense. I could not shake the image of that man watching the children. My son chattered about his day, but my mind was elsewhere. I tried to reassure myself that I was being paranoid, but the feeling lingered. Once we got home, I decided to call my husband. I needed to share what had happened. As I recounted the events, I could hear the concern in his voice. "You did the right thing by saying something. It is better to be safe," he told me. That night, I put my son to bed, reading him a story as I always did. But even as I tucked him in, I couldn't help but peek out the window, half expecting to see that man lurking in the shadows. I made sure all the doors were locked and the windows secured. Days passed, and I tried to put the incident behind me. But I found myself more alert when picking up my son. I kept an eye on the entrance, always looking for any sign of that man. One afternoon, I arrived a little early. I sat in the parking lot, scanning the area, waiting for the daycare to open. I felt a bit silly, but I could not shake the fear. When the doors finally opened, I walked inside, but this time I did not see that man. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But as I signed in, I noticed the receptionist watching me closely. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes, I had a strange encounter a few days ago. I worry sometimes." She nodded, but her eyes seemed distant. "It happens, I suppose. Just keep an eye out, okay?" I promised her I would, but my instincts were still on high alert. That weekend, I decided to take a different route home. I felt I needed a break from that place. As I drove, I took the long way through familiar neighborhoods. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the houses. I felt slightly more at ease. Then, as I turned onto a quieter street, my heart dropped. There, standing on the corner, was the man. He was just standing there, looking down the street. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Should I drive past? My instinct screamed at me to get away. I drove slowly, trying to keep my eyes on the road, praying he wouldn't look my way. As I passed him, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I glanced over just as he lifted his head, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no mistaking it. It was him. I drove faster, my heart racing, until I reached the main road. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I finally took a deep breath, willing myself to calm down. I told my husband about it that night. "We will be more careful," he assured me. We discussed the possibility of finding a new daycare. I hoped that this would be the end of it. That man could not keep watching. I felt like I was finally regaining control. But I still kept looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when I would not have to feel afraid anymore. As the days turned into weeks, I remained vigilant. I was not going to let fear take over my life. My son was safe, and I would do everything in my power to keep it that way. I have always found some comfort in doing my laundry late at night. There is something about the quiet hum of the machines and the flickering fluorescent lights that felt oddly soothing. I usually went to the same 24-hour laundromat near my apartment. It was a small place, but it never seemed crowded at night, which was perfect for me. One Saturday night, I arrived around midnight. As I walked in, the familiar smell of detergent and fabric softener filled the air. The place was mostly empty. Just me and a few machines softly whirring in the background. I started loading my clothes into the washer when I noticed a man sitting in the corner. He was not doing laundry, he was just sitting there, staring at me. At first, I thought he might be waiting for a friend or something. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. As I moved from one machine to another, I caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of the glass on the machines. He had a scruffy beard and wore a dark hoodie. His eyes never left me, and that made my stomach churn. I put my clothes in the dryer, trying to focus on my phone to ignore him. I could still feel his gaze, heavy and intense. It was as if he were studying me, memorizing my movements. I glanced up a few times, but he remained still, just watching. After about 20 minutes, I felt I had enough. The uneasy feeling settled deeper in my chest. I started to gather my things, but I couldn't shake the sensation that he was still watching. I waited for the dryer to finish, trying to act normal. When it finally stopped, I pulled out my clothes and stuffed them into my bag as quickly as I could. I could feel the man's eyes on me as I hurriedly moved toward the door. The bell jingled as I pushed it open, and the cool air hit me. I sighed in relief, thinking I had finally escaped the strange situation. But when I stepped into the parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the man was following me. He was not walking fast, but he was definitely moving in my direction. Panic surged through me. I could not believe this was happening. I quickened my pace, trying to keep my cool. I walked toward my car, my heart racing. The parking lot was dimly lit, and I could feel the shadows closing in around me. I fumbled with my keys, trying to get them out of my bag without dropping anything. I could hear his footsteps getting closer. "Hey," I heard him call out. My blood ran cold. I did not turn around. I kept walking, but I could feel him gaining on me. "Wait," he said, sounding almost casual. I finally reached my car and turned to face him, hoping to see some sign of reason. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You dropped something inside," he said, gesturing toward the laundromat. "I just wanted to let you know." I felt a flicker of confusion. "I didn't drop anything," I replied, keeping my voice firm. I scanned the parking lot, hoping for someone else to be around. "Really?" "I could have sworn I saw you drop something when you were folding," he said, still taking slow steps toward me. His demeanor was unsettling. There was no friendly tone in his voice. It was cold and calculated. "I'm fine, thank you," I said, my grip tightening around my keys. He took another step forward, and I felt the adrenaline rush through me. I opened my car door, and my hand instinctively reached for the lock. "You shouldn't be here," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "Why not?" "I am just trying to help," he replied, his voice slightly higher, almost mocking. I slammed the car door shut and locked it, my heart racing. "I am calling the police," I said, not even sure if I had the strength to pull my phone out. "Go ahead," he sneered, his eyes narrowing even further. "I am just being friendly." I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. This was not friendly. This was threatening. I turned my head slightly to scan the area again, hoping for any sign of other people. But the parking lot was empty and quiet. "I really don't want to talk to you," I said, my voice rising slightly. I glanced at my phone in my bag and decided it was better to call than to let him get any closer. "Why are you afraid?" he asked, still inching toward me. "I just want to chat." "Leave me alone," I shouted, and he froze for a moment, surprised by my outburst. That gave me the opening I needed. I pulled my phone out and dialed 911, keeping my eyes locked on him. As soon as he realized what I was doing, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the laundromat. "Call the cops if you want." "They can't protect you," he shouted back, but he was retreating. I stayed by my car, keeping my phone pressed to my ear, waiting for the operator to pick up. My hands trembled as I kept my eyes on him, ready to drive away if he turned back. Once I was connected, I explained everything to the operator, my voice shaking as I described the man and the situation. I stayed on the line until the police arrived, keeping my eyes on the laundromat entrance. When the officers arrived, they quickly spotted the man, who had turned back to watch us. They approached him, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I got out of my car and stepped closer, still keeping a safe distance. I could hear snippets of the conversation. "What are you doing here?" one officer asked. The man's face twisted into a defiant grin as he replied. I could not make out the words, but I felt a chill run down my spine. After a few tense moments, the officers pulled him aside. They spoke quietly, but I could see their serious expressions. The man glanced back at me once, and I felt my stomach drop. He was dangerous. Eventually, the officers turned back to me. "We are going to check his ID and run a background check," one of them said. "You did the right thing by calling us." I nodded, feeling the adrenaline finally start to fade. "Do you want to press charges?" the other officer asked. I hesitated, thinking back to how close he had gotten. "Yes," I replied. "I want to make sure he does not do this again." The officers took my statement, and I felt a sense of safety returning as they handled the situation. After they finished, they assured me that they would keep an eye on the laundromat and make sure the man would not return. As I finally drove away from the laundromat, I felt relief wash over me. I was shaken but safe. I promised myself that I would never go back there alone again, and I hoped that no one else would have to deal with someone like him. I didn't want to stop, not at first. I was passing through this small town, just trying to get back home. I had a project I wanted to get started on before the weekend was over, replacing some old flooring in the guest room, and I was missing a few things. Nails, some wood glue, and a new utility knife. Simple stuff. But when I saw the hardware store sign off the main road, I figured it wouldn't hurt to stop. The place didn't look like much, just a small, rundown building with a weathered sign that said Smith's Hardware in faded letters. There were a few pickup trucks parked outside, and one of those plastic open signs hanging crooked in the window. I parked my car and went inside, figuring I'd be in and out in a few minutes. The moment I walked in, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, and I glanced around. The shelves were packed tight with tools, screws, and all sorts of stuff, but everything felt off. The lights were dim, and there was this faint smell, like old wood and something metallic. There was a man behind the counter, maybe in his late 50s. He had thinning hair and wore a stained apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes snapped up as soon as I walked in, like he had been waiting for me. He didn't say anything right away, just watched me as I wandered down one of the aisles. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. I found what I needed pretty quickly: a pack of nails, some wood glue, and a decent-looking utility knife, and headed toward the register. As I approached the counter, the man finally spoke. "You working on something?" His voice was raspy, like he'd been smoking too much, but there was something in his tone that rubbed me the wrong way. Too eager, maybe. "Yeah," I said, setting the items down. "Just replacing some flooring at home." He nodded slowly, like he was considering something. "That old knife you got there, it won't last long. You're better off with a heavier one, something that'll cut through the tougher stuff." I glanced at the knife. It looked fine to me. This should work for what I need. He stared at me for a second too long, then gave a slow smile. "Well, suit yourself. Just don't come back complaining when it breaks on you." I didn't respond, just waited while he rang up my things. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, like he was sizing me up, like he knew something I didn't. It made my skin crawl. "That'll be $22.50, he said, finally looking away. I handed him the cash, and as he gave me my change, he spoke again. "You doing the work yourself?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, keeping my answer short. I didn't feel like getting into a conversation with this guy. He nodded again, like he approved. "I could come by, give you a hand if you need it." I laughed, thinking he was just making small talk. "No, thanks. I've got it covered." But he didn't laugh. His smile stayed, but it was wrong, like it didn't belong on his face. "No trouble at all. I know my way around this kind of stuff. Been doing it for years." You'd be surprised how many folks think they can handle it, but it turns out they can't. I could save you some time. I shook my head, trying to be polite but firm. Really, I'm fine. I'm just doing a small job. He didn't seem to hear me. Where's your place? Just outside of town? I could swing by tonight, get it done quicker. That's when I started to feel really uneasy. He wasn't just being friendly. There was something else going on here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His insistence, the way he kept leaning forward, as if he was trying to pull me into something. I appreciate the offer, I said, taking a step back from the counter, but I'm good. I grabbed my bag of supplies and started to head for the door. But just as I reached it, I heard him call after me. You sure? I'm happy to help. I could follow you back right now. I turned, my hand on the doorknob, and gave him a final look. I'm sure. Thanks anyway. I didn't wait for him to respond. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the fading daylight. As I walked to my car, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting him to be standing in the doorway, watching me. But the door was closed, and the parking lot was empty, save for the 2 trucks. I got into my car, tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I couldn't shake the weird feeling in my gut. It wasn't just that the guy was being pushy. There was something more to it, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to slip up somehow. I pulled out of the lot and got back on the main road, heading toward home. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. It was just a weird interaction. Small towns were full of weird people, right? But as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those trucks following me. And then I did. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. There were plenty of trucks in this part of the country. But as I kept driving, I noticed it stayed with me, hanging back just far enough to not seem obvious, but never too far behind. My chest tightened, and I felt my palms start to sweat. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just someone heading in the same direction. But I didn't like it. Not one bit. I decided to test it. I turned off onto a side road that I knew led to a dead end. If the truck followed me down there, then I'd know for sure. Sure enough, it did. I felt a cold knot in my stomach as I watched the truck in the mirror. It was the same one I'd seen parked outside the hardware store. There was no mistaking it. I kept driving down the narrow road, trying to stay calm. I told myself that I just needed to get to the end, turn around, and drive past him. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd just keep going. But as I approached the dead end, the truck sped up, closing the distance between us. My heart was racing now. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I wasn't going to find out by sticking around. I pulled to the side of the road and threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed up as fast as I could. The truck kept coming, getting closer and closer until it was just a few feet away. I floored the gas, spinning the car around and speeding back toward the main road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was following me again. I just kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Eventually, I made it back to the highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that town, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what that guy wanted, or why he was so insistent on following me home. But I'm glad I didn't find out. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it felt like he had other plans. I never took that exit again, and I never went back to that hardware store. And now, whenever I need supplies for a project, I make sure to stop at a big chain store, somewhere crowded, somewhere safe. I lived in a shared apartment with 3 other people. We were all friends at first, but things changed once we settled in. Over time, I started to notice things missing from my room. At first, it was small stuff: my favorite mug, a pair of headphones, a book I had been reading. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I misplaced them. But then it became more noticeable. One evening, I searched my room thoroughly, moving things around and checking every nook and cranny. I was certain I had not lost them. I started to suspect one of my roommates. Emily seemed to have an odd way of borrowing things without asking, often forgetting to return them. The others, Mike and Josh, were more laid back. They respected boundaries, but Emily was different. I mentioned it casually to the others, but they just laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid. The feeling of unease gnawed at me. I decided I had to do something. I had an old security camera lying around from when I lived with my parents, so I set it up in my room, hoping to catch Emily in the act. I pointed it at my door, thinking if she came in, I would know for sure. The first night, I fell asleep feeling anxious, half expecting to wake up to the sound of my door creaking open. I had to remind myself that I might be overreacting. The next morning, I woke up early and rushed to check the footage. I felt both excitement and dread, but when I scrolled through the video, I was surprised to find nothing. No sign of anyone entering my room. I convinced myself it was a waste of time. I continued with my routine, but the feeling of things disappearing did not let up. A week later, I decided to give it another try. I set the camera up again, adjusting it to ensure I could capture more of the room. I went to bed that night feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. The next morning, I woke up, heart racing, and checked the footage again. I scrolled through the hours, my anticipation building, but I felt a chill as I saw something I did not expect. Around 3 a.m., my door creaked open. It was not Emily, though. A figure slipped in, barely making a sound. I could not see their face clearly. They moved quietly, almost like a shadow. I felt sick. Who was this? Why were they in my room? My heart pounded as I continued watching. The intruder moved to my desk, rifling through my things. They picked up my laptop, glancing around as if they were worried someone would catch them. I wanted to scream, but I was frozen, my hands shaking as I kept watching. After a minute, they dropped my laptop back onto the desk and turned toward my bed. I gasped as I realized I was still asleep, completely unaware. The intruder leaned over me, and I could barely see their face. I could only make out a hood pulled tightly over their head. I felt panic rising in my chest. What were they planning to do? Suddenly, they stepped back and hurried out of the room, the door closing softly behind them. I scrambled to the video controls, my heart racing. I replayed the moment again and again, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. This was not just someone borrowing my things. This was an invasion. After the shock wore off, I grabbed my phone and called Mike. I felt like I had to tell someone. I could not deal with this alone. He answered, groggy from sleep, but I rushed through my words. You need to come over. I think someone has been in my room. I could hear him sit up, concern creeping into his voice. What do you mean? Like, what happened? I explained everything, and his tone shifted from confusion to alarm. You need to call the police, he said firmly. I agreed. I needed help, but I felt a mix of dread and relief at the thought of getting someone involved. Mike arrived within minutes. I had not even realized how tense I had been until I saw him walk through the door. I hurried to show him the footage, my hands trembling as I clicked on the right file. Watch this, I said, and I could see the color drain from his face as the video played. Who the hell is that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't know. I replied, my throat tight. But they have been coming in while I sleep. What should we do? Mike paced the room, his mind racing. First, we call the police. They need to know someone has been in here. I nodded, feeling a weight lift slightly. I called the police, explaining everything I had seen. They assured me they would send someone right away. In the meantime, Mike suggested I stay at his place until they arrived. I didn't argue. While we waited, I locked my bedroom door and made sure the camera was still running. I felt a mix of fear and determination. I would not let this person take control of my life. When the police arrived, they listened carefully to my story. I showed them the footage, and their expressions changed as they saw the intruder. This is serious, one officer said. We will need to take a copy of this. Can you tell us if you recognize the person? I have no idea who it is, I said, feeling defeated. I've never seen them before. The officers discussed among themselves, and I felt the tension in the room. They took my information, assured me they would investigate, and advised me to stay vigilant. They told me to contact them if anything else happened or if I saw the person again. Once they left, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I spent the night at Mike's place, grateful for the company. I told him about all the little things I had noticed missing. It felt good to share that burden. The next few days were filled with anxiety. I stayed at Mike's, unable to sleep at home. I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The police kept me updated, but they had not found anything significant. After a week, I decided I needed to confront the situation. I could not let fear control my life. I went back to the apartment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The familiar space felt strange and unsettling. I walked into my room, checking that everything was in place. My laptop was still there, my books still lined up on the shelf. I noticed nothing had been disturbed since the police had left. Maybe the intruder had moved on. As I settled in, I decided to keep the camera running, hoping for peace of mind. That night, I locked the door, feeling a little safer. I fell asleep, exhausted from the stress. A few nights later, I woke up suddenly, feeling a chill in the air. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark room, heart racing. I glanced at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. again. Just like before. I could hear something, a soft sound outside my door. My heart thudded loudly in my chest. I sat up and strained to listen. The noise grew louder. Someone was trying to open my door. Adrenaline coursed through me as I reached for my phone. I fumbled with it, pressing the home button to turn on the screen. The light illuminated my room, and I felt a sense of panic rising. The door handle turned slowly, and I knew I had to act fast. I hit the button to alert the police, my fingers trembling. I glanced toward the door as it creaked open slightly. I turned my camera on, catching the moment just as a figure slipped into my room. It was the same intruder. They were back. This time, I was ready. I didn't scream, but I felt fury rising within me. I wanted to confront this person. As they stepped closer, I shouted, "Who are you? Get out." The intruder froze, eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension thick in the air. Then, without a word, they turned and ran. I was right behind them, bolting out of my room and down the hall. I sprinted after them, adrenaline pushing me forward. I saw them rush toward the exit, and I shouted for help. I could hear my roommates waking up, confused shouts echoing in the background. As the intruder reached the front door, I saw Mike step out of his room. "What is going on?" he yelled, and the figure turned to run in the opposite direction. I reached for my phone to call the police again, but Mike grabbed my arm. "Let's go after them," he said, and I nodded, heart racing. We dashed outside, looking for any sign of the intruder. We searched the parking lot but found nothing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we checked around the building. After what felt like an eternity, we saw a figure slipping around the corner, darting away into the shadows. "Hey!" I shouted, but they vanished into the darkness. The moment felt surreal, as if we had just witnessed a ghost slipping away. We called the police again, but this time I felt different. I had stood up to them. I had not let fear control me. The police arrived soon after, taking statements and investigating the area. Later that night, we sat down together, still shaken but relieved. I had faced the intruder, and I felt stronger. They may have gotten away, but I was not going to let this define me. I would be vigilant, and I would take back my space. I would not let fear linger in my life any longer. I've always been interested in my family's history, and after years of listening to old stories from relatives, I decided to dig a little deeper. I had traced my family back to a small town, one that wasn't far from where I lived. My great-grandfather had grown up there, and I thought it might be interesting to learn more about his life and the town itself. I didn't expect much. Just thought I'd spend a quiet afternoon going through some old records. The town wasn't exactly a tourist destination. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and seemed like the kind of place where not much ever happened. The main street had a few shops, a diner, and the library where I was headed. The library was small, tucked between two other buildings, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Inside, it smelled like old books and dust. There was a single librarian sitting behind the desk, a woman who looked like she had been working there forever. She glanced up when I walked in, but didn't say anything. Just watched me as I made my way over to the records section. I wasn't sure where to start, so I grabbed a few old newspapers and started flipping through them. Most of it was just local news, nothing exciting. I was about to give up and leave when I found something strange. It was a small article, buried in the back of a paper from the 1950s. It mentioned a missing person, just a brief note about a man who had disappeared without a trace. There wasn't much information, just a name and the date he was last seen. I didn't think much of it at first. Missing persons happen everywhere, even in quiet towns like this. But then I found another article. And another. All about people who had disappeared over the years. The more I looked, the more I found. It seemed like every few years, someone would just vanish. The articles were always short, always vague. No follow-up, no explanation. Just gone. I went back to the librarian, carrying a few of the articles with me. When I asked her about it, her expression changed. At first, she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. But when I showed her the articles, she got defensive. Said it wasn't something people around here talked about. That made me curious. Why wouldn't they talk about it? I wasn't asking for much, just wanted to know if there was any more information. Maybe there had been a string of kidnappings or something, and they didn't want to scare people. I figured there had to be more to it than just these little notes in the paper. But the librarian got this weird look in her eyes. She leaned in close and told me I should stop looking into it. Said I was digging into things that were better left alone. I thought she was being dramatic, trying to make it sound more mysterious than it really was. But there was something about the way she said it that made my skin crawl. I went back to the records, ignoring her warning. I found an old file, tucked away in a drawer that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. It was full of information on local missing persons cases. Dozens of them, going back decades. Names, dates, descriptions. All of them were locals. All of them disappeared in or near the town. As I read through the file, I started to notice a pattern. The disappearances weren't random. They all happened around the same time of year, late summer, just a few weeks apart. And they all happened in the same general area, a part of town that was mostly abandoned now. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but it felt like there was something more to it. Something the town didn't want people to know. I decided to ask the librarian again, this time pushing for more answers. When I brought up the file, she looked genuinely angry. Told me I needed to leave, that I shouldn't be snooping around in things I didn't understand. She said it was dangerous, that people had been hurt before because they didn't listen. I didn't know what to make of it. Why was she so upset? It was just old news, nothing more than that. But the more she talked, the more I realized she was scared. Not angry, scared. She kept glancing around like someone might be listening, her voice dropping to a whisper as she told me to leave town, to forget what I'd seen. I didn't leave. I should have, but I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something. Something important. I decided to go to the area where most of the disappearances had happened. It was only a few blocks away, and I figured it couldn't hurt to take a look. The area was run down, like I expected. A few boarded-up buildings, overgrown yards. It looked like no one had lived there in years. But as I walked through the streets, I got this feeling like I was being watched. Every time I turned around, there was no one there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. I found an old house that matched the description in one of the articles. It was one of the last places a missing person had been seen before they vanished. The door was locked, but a window around the back was broken, so I climbed in. The inside was just as run down as the outside, dust everywhere, old furniture covered in sheets. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but the house felt wrong. I can't explain it. It was just a house, empty like all the others, but something about it made my skin crawl. It was too quiet, too still. I started to leave when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone passing by, but they didn't go away. They got closer. Slow, deliberate steps, coming right toward the house. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crouched behind an old couch, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But they didn't. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. I couldn't see them from where I was hiding, but I could hear them walking through the house, their footsteps echoing off the walls. They were moving slowly, like they were looking for something. Or someone. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. I could hear them right on the other side of the couch. I thought for sure they had found me, that any second now they'd reach down and grab me. But after a moment, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they walked through the house, then out the door. I waited a long time before I moved, just in case they were still outside. When I finally got up, I made a run for it, climbing back out the window and sprinting back to the main street. I didn't stop running until I was back at the library. The librarian was waiting for me. She must have known I would come back. She didn't say anything, just shook her head and handed me an envelope. I didn't open it until I got back to my car. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was hard to read. But it was a list of names. All the names I had seen in the missing persons file, plus a few more. At the bottom of the list was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Leave. Before you're next. I didn't need any more convincing. I left town that day and never went back. I don't know what's going on in that town, and I don't want to know. But I'm sure of one thing, the people there know exactly what's happening. And they don't want anyone else finding out. I've lived in the same small town for years. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other's names, and nothing much happens. There's only one post office, an old brick building on the edge of town. I've used it for years, never thought twice about it. It's just one of those places that fades into the background until it didn't. About 6 months ago, I started noticing something strange. The post office would be closed during regular hours, sometimes for a whole day. I'd show up to mail a package or pick something up, and the doors would be locked, lights off. No sign, no explanation, just closed. The first couple of times, I shrugged it off. Everyone needs a break, right? Maybe the postmaster was out sick or something. But it started happening more often. I checked the hours posted on the door, and I knew I wasn't going crazy. They were supposed to be open, but the place was locked up tight. People in town began to notice too. I'd hear them mention it at the grocery store or at the diner, asking each other, what's going on with the post office? No one seemed to have any answers. The postmaster, this guy named Don, wasn't exactly the chatty type. He'd been working there as long as I could remember. He was always polite, always did his job, but something about him was a little off. He didn't smile much, and he rarely made eye contact. Still, it never struck me as anything more than a guy who didn't like his job. One day, I needed to send some important documents out. I had to get them in the mail that day, no exceptions. I drove to the post office at around 10 a.m., well within the open hours. But again, the doors were locked. This time, though, it wasn't dark inside. I could see lights on, and there was movement. Someone was in there. I knocked, but no one came to the door. I knocked again, harder, and then I heard muffled voices. It sounded like at least 2 people, maybe more, talking inside. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear, but the voices were too low to make out what they were saying. I knocked one more time, and finally, the door creaked open just a crack. Don was standing there, blocking the entrance. He didn't look surprised to see me, but there was something off in his eyes. He stared at me for a moment before speaking, his voice flat. "We're closed." "Closed?" I said, pointing at the sign. "It says you're open." He didn't even glance at the sign. "We're closed." I was starting to get frustrated. "I just need to send a package. It'll take 2 minutes." He didn't move. "Come back tomorrow." I tried to look past him, but he stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the inside. The voices I heard earlier were gone now, like they'd stopped the second I knocked. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a streak of what looked like dried mud on Don's shirt, smeared across his chest like he'd been in a hurry. His hands were shaking slightly, too. "What's going on in there?" I asked, my voice more firm this time. "Nothing," he said, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. He glanced behind him, just for a second, but it was enough. "You should go." At that point, something clicked in my gut, and I knew something wasn't right. But before I could say anything else, Don stepped forward, pushing the door shut in my face. I heard the lock click into place, and then there was silence again. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the door. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Why was the place locked? Who was inside with Dawn, and why were they trying so hard to keep it hidden? I walked back to my car, my heart beating faster than it should have been. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Dawn standing at the window, watching me. It sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong, and I wasn't about to let it go. The next day, I went back. This time, I didn't go during normal hours. I waited until after the post office was supposed to be closed. If Don was up to something, I figured it might be easier to catch him off guard. I parked a little way down the street and watched the building for a while. There were no cars, no signs of life. It looked completely deserted, but I didn't believe that for a second. After about an hour, I saw movement. The door opened, and Don stepped out, looking around like he was checking if anyone was watching. He didn't see me, tucked away in my car, and I watched as he locked the door behind him and walked off down the street. Once he was out of sight, I got out of my car and hurried toward the post office. I didn't have a key, but the door wasn't as secure as I thought it would be. It only took a few minutes of fiddling with the lock before I managed to get it open. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. It was thick, heavy, like mildew and something rotten. The air was stale, like no one had been inside for days. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen Don here just hours earlier. I walked through the lobby, past the empty counters, and toward the back of the building where the mail was usually sorted. The lights were on, casting long shadows across the floor. As I moved deeper into the building, I heard something muffled sounds, almost like whispers. It was coming from a room down the hall. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. The door to the room was cracked open, and I could see a dim light inside. I pushed the door open just enough to see what was inside. What I saw made my stomach turn. There was a man tied to a chair in the middle of the room, his head slumped forward. He was covered in dirt and blood, his clothes torn and filthy. He wasn't moving, but I could hear faint breaths coming from him. Next to him, on the floor, was a shovel covered in fresh dirt. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there, had to call the police. But as I turned to leave, I heard the door to the post office creak open. My blood ran cold. Don was back. I froze, my mind racing. I couldn't let him find me here. I glanced around the room, looking for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The only thing I could do was stay quiet and hope he didn't come this way. I heard his footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate. He was humming to himself, a low, tuneless sound that made my skin crawl. I pressed myself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I could see his shadow in the hallway, long and dark. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. But after what felt like an eternity, he moved on, his footsteps fading as he walked down the hall. I didn't waste any more time. As soon as I was sure he was far enough away, I slipped out of the room and made a run for the front door. I didn't look back. I just ran, my heart racing, my mind spinning with what I'd just seen. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I called the police, told them everything I'd seen. They came, asked me questions, searched the post office. But by the time they got there, the man in the chair was gone. The room was empty, clean like nothing had ever happened. They found Don later that night, trying to leave town. He didn't put up a fight when they arrested him. Turns out, he'd been involved in some kind of smuggling operation, using the post office as a cover. The man I'd seen tied up was one of his partners who tried to back out of the deal. They never found the guy, though. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I decided to camp out there alone. I'd gone camping before, but never by myself. I figured it would be a good way to clear my head for the weekend. Just me, the trees, and some quiet. The site I picked wasn't far off the beaten path, about a 20-minute hike from where I'd parked the car. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I'd found on a trail map. I liked that, the idea of being away from people, out in the middle of nowhere. The first night was fine. I set up the tent, started a fire, cooked some food. Everything felt peaceful. The woods were calm, and the sounds of the night animals were kind of comforting. I spent a few hours by the fire, just watching the flames, listening to the crackling, enjoying the stillness around me. It was dark, but not too dark. The moon was bright enough to light up the clearing. I stayed up until the fire started to die down, then crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and fell asleep without much trouble. I don't know what woke me up the next morning. I didn't hear anything, didn't feel anything, but something was off. You know how sometimes you just get that feeling, like something's not quite right? That's what it was. I woke up with this weird sense that something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. It was quiet, too quiet for morning in the woods. Usually, there'd be birds, maybe some rustling, but it was dead silent. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the grogginess. The sun was up, but it hadn't been long. The fire pit was cold, no embers left, just some charred logs and ash. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. There was a mark on the side of my tent. At first, I thought maybe it was just dirt or something, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't natural. It was a symbol, scratched into the fabric with something sharp, like a knife. It was about the size of my hand, and it looked like an X, but with these weird curls coming off the ends, almost like claws. I knelt down, running my fingers over it, trying to figure out how it got there. My heart started pounding a little. I knew for a fact that Mark wasn't there when I set up the tent. I would have noticed it. It was deep enough that I should have heard something during the night, but I hadn't. No sounds, no footsteps, nothing. Someone had been out here, near my tent, while I was asleep. I stood up and scanned the clearing, but everything looked normal. No sign of anyone. Just the trees, the dirt, the fire pit. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just some prank. Maybe someone had passed through the woods during the night, saw my tent, and decided to mess with me. That had to be it. No big deal, right? But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. The mark wasn't random. It wasn't like someone had just scribbled on my tent. It was precise, like they'd taken their time with it. I felt that uneasy knot in my stomach growing, but I forced myself to keep it together. I decided to pack up and leave. No point in sticking around if someone was messing with me. I threw everything into my backpack, not bothering to fold up the tent properly, just stuffing it in as fast as I could. I wanted to get out of there, get back to my car, and go home. But when I got to my car, the tires were slashed. All four of them. Deep cuts, like someone had taken a knife and just stabbed right through the rubber. My heart sank. I stood there, staring at the car, my mind racing. I was in the middle of nowhere, no cell signal, no way to call for help. Even if I tried to walk back to the main road, it would take hours, and there was no guarantee anyone would pass by. I wasn't thinking straight. I should have been scared, but I was more angry than anything. Who the hell would do something like this? What kind of person follows someone into the woods just to mess with their car, mess with their tent? I turned around and started heading back to the campsite, figuring I'd at least grab the rest of my stuff. Maybe I could try to walk to a ranger station, or at least find somewhere with a signal. But when I got back to the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The tent was open. The zipper was pulled all the way down, and my sleeping bag was dragged halfway out, like someone had been rummaging through it. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure of it. I backed up, my heart pounding now, adrenaline kicking in. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I hide? Run? But where would I go? I was in the middle of the woods, miles from anyone. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint, but it was there. Footsteps, crunching leaves, coming from somewhere behind the trees. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was getting closer. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I grabbed my backpack, the one thing I had left, and bolted. I didn't care which direction I went, I just needed to get away. My legs were moving faster than they ever had, but the trees seemed to close in around me, making it harder to move. I could hear the footsteps behind me, still there, still following. I didn't stop running until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. My lungs were burning, my legs shaking, but I didn't dare stop. I kept going, weaving through the trees, trying to find my way back to the trail, back to the car. I wasn't even thinking straight at this point, just running on pure instinct. When I finally made it back to the trail, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. I listened, straining to hear any sign of footsteps, but it was quiet again. Too quiet. The woods felt wrong, like they were watching me. I stayed there for a while, trying to catch my breath, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go back to the car, not with the tires slashed. I didn't want to go back to the campsite either. Whoever was out there, they knew I was alone. They knew I couldn't leave. Eventually, I started walking, sticking to the trail, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere. I don't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours. My legs were numb, my mind blank, just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. When I finally reached the main road, I almost cried. There was no one around, but I knew I was closer to help. I followed the road, sticking to the shoulder, keeping an eye out for any cars. It was a long walk, but eventually, a pickup truck came down the road, and I waved it down. The driver was an older guy, probably in his 50s, with a kind face. He asked if I needed help, and I just nodded, too exhausted to explain everything. He gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I finally managed to call for help. I never found out who it was. The police said they'd look into it, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably just kids, they said. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Someone was out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I haven't been camping since. I had planned this weekend retreat to a small town for some peace and quiet. I rented a small cabin near the edge of a park, a place surrounded by trees and a gentle stream. It seemed perfect for some solitude, a break from the city. The first day, I explored the park. It was quiet, with only the rustling leaves and the chirping birds breaking the silence. I noticed a group of locals gathered near the playground, laughing and playing games. They seemed to be having a good time. I observed them from a distance, feeling a strange pull to join in. On the second day, I decided to be brave. I walked over to the group. They were tossing a ball back and forth, and the atmosphere felt light. I approached them with a smile, trying to blend in. "Hey, mind if I join you?" I asked, hoping they would welcome me. They looked at me, and for a moment there was silence. A tall man with a broad build stepped forward. He had a strong jaw and an unsettling stare. "What do you want?" he asked. I felt a chill run down my spine. I just thought it looked like fun. "I'm new in town." "New, huh?" Another member of the group, a woman with wild hair, sneered. "We don't take kindly to outsiders here." I chuckled nervously, thinking it was a joke. "I'm just here for the weekend. I won't cause any trouble." "Trouble?" the tall man said, his voice low and serious. "You don't belong here. We don't want you here." "Come on, I'm just trying to have some fun," I said, my heart racing as I tried to laugh it off. They exchanged glances, their expressions turning dark. "You should leave," the woman said sharply. "Now." My instinct told me to walk away, but I didn't want to seem weak. I hesitated, trying to figure out what to say. "I'm just playing a game. I don't mean any harm." The man stepped closer, invading my personal space. "You don't understand. This is our place. You are not welcome." I felt the atmosphere shift. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a tension that made my stomach knot. "I'm just visiting," I insisted. "I'll leave in a couple of days." The group began to close in around me. "You need to go," the man said, his voice cold. "If you don't leave, we will make you regret it." Panic washed over me, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I took a step back, trying to create space between us. Okay, I'll go. Right now," the woman snapped. I turned to leave, my mind racing. I could hear their whispers behind me, low and threatening. I hurried away from the park, glancing back to see them watching me, their expressions filled with disdain. I made my way back to the cabin, feeling the weight of their stares on my back. I locked the door behind me, my heart still racing. I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted, that I had misread the situation. But as night fell, I could not shake the feeling of dread. The next morning, I decided I would not return to the park. I would pack my things and leave. I had no intention of getting involved with those people again. As I packed, I could hear the sounds of the town waking up outside, cars driving by, people chatting, but the thought of the group from the park lingered in my mind. I left the cabin and started my car, but the engine sputtered. I turned the key again, frustration mounting as it refused to start. After several attempts, I gave up. I stepped out of the car, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over me. I needed help. I remembered seeing a small diner down the road. I decided to walk there, hoping someone could help me with my car. As I walked, I felt uneasy. The sun was shining, but the warmth did little to calm my nerves. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. When I reached the diner, I opened the door and stepped inside. The atmosphere was friendly, with the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. A few patrons looked up from their meals, but I didn't see anyone I recognized. I approached the counter, and a waitress smiled at me. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "I need help with my car." "It won't start," I said, feeling a wave of relief. "Is there anyone who could take a look at it?" The waitress frowned. "Oh, I'm not sure. Most of the locals are busy with their own things." Just then, I heard the door swing open behind me. I turned, and my heart sank as I saw the tall man from the park step inside. He scanned the diner, and when he spotted me, his eyes narrowed. He walked toward me, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. "Look who it is," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "Thought you could run away, did you?" The waitress looked between us, confusion spreading across her face. "Is everything okay here?" "Stay out of this," the man growled, his voice low and threatening. I took a step back, feeling the tension rise in the room. "I just want to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Not so fast," he replied, moving closer. "You need to learn your place." Before I could react, he reached for me, and I instinctively pushed back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The diner fell silent, all eyes on us. The waitress looked frightened, but she didn't move. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my heart racing. "Enough." The waitress finally stepped between us. "You can't do this here. Leave him alone." The man hesitated, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you are doing," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Get out, or I will call the sheriff," the waitress insisted, her voice steady. The man glared at her, then back at me. "You are lucky. This isn't over." With that, he turned and stormed out of the diner. I stood there, trembling. The waitress turned to me, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though I felt anything but. "I just need to get out of here." "Let me help you," she said, her tone softening. "I can call someone to look at your car. It is better to stay here for now." I agreed, grateful for her kindness. She made the call while I sat at the counter, my mind racing. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons on me, but I tried to focus on the waitress's reassuring presence. When the mechanic arrived, I felt a wave of relief. He assessed my car quickly and told me it was a simple fix. I watched him work, thankful to be away from that man and his threats. After a short while, my car was up and running. I thanked the waitress and the mechanic profusely, feeling a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. As I drove away from the diner, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the tall man behind me. But there was nothing, just the quiet road stretching ahead. I left the town, feeling both shaken and relieved. I knew I had made the right choice to leave. That group in the park was dangerous, and I would never forget the way they had looked at me. I would find another place to retreat, somewhere I could feel safe. As I drove, I promised myself I would never return to that town again. The thought of those locals and their aggression haunted me, but I was determined to move forward and find peace elsewhere. I took my dog, Max, to the local park every evening. It was a routine that I cherished. The park was usually quiet at that hour, and I appreciated the fresh air and a chance for Max to run around. On this particular evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. The air felt crisp, and I could hear the distant laughter of children playing. As we walked along the path, I noticed a group of teenagers sitting on a bench. They seemed to be having a good time, laughing and joking among themselves. I didn't pay them much attention at first. Max was busy sniffing at the ground, his nose buried in the grass. I moved a little closer to the edge of the path to give them space as I walked by. As I approached, I heard them whispering to each other. I could feel their eyes on me, but I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on Max. Just as I passed them, I heard one of them say my name. It was strange because I had never seen any of them before. I looked back over my shoulder, and they were all standing now, still whispering. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you just say my name?" I asked, my voice steady, though I felt a knot in my stomach. They all looked at each other, and one of them, a girl with short black hair, stepped forward. "We just wanted to talk to you," she said, her tone light but her eyes intense. "We know you." I frowned, feeling a mixture of confusion and unease. "You know me? From where?" They exchanged glances again, and my unease deepened. I turned to walk away, urging Max to keep moving, but then I heard it. "Come on, don't be like that. We just want to have a little chat," another one called out. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Max seemed to sense something was off too. He stayed close to my side, his ears perked up. But when I looked back, I saw they had started following me, their whispers growing louder. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my heart racing. "Because we need to talk, Tom," the girl said again. My heart sank. How did she know my name? I had not introduced myself, nor had anyone in the park called out to me. I turned a corner, hoping to lose them, but they were persistent. They continued to follow at a distance, just close enough that I could hear snippets of their conversation. "He thinks he can ignore us," one of them said. I could feel panic rising within me. I glanced around, looking for other people in the park. It was still relatively empty, and the sun was nearly gone. I decided to head toward the playground, thinking there might be some parents around. As I approached, the group picked up their pace. "You don't need to run, Tom. We are just friends," the girl called out, her voice dripping with mockery. I felt a wave of anger mixed with fear. "I don't know you," I shouted back, trying to sound more assertive than I felt. They laughed, and it sent chills down my spine. I reached the playground, hoping to find someone who could help, but it was empty. I glanced over my shoulder, and they had stopped a few feet away, standing just outside the light from the playground's lamps. I could see their silhouettes, but their expressions were hidden in the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Because we can, Tom." "You are in our territory now," the girl said, and the others laughed again. The words echoed in my mind. I felt trapped, like I was in a game I didn't understand. I looked at Max, who was still by my side, his fur bristling. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to confront them. I had to protect Max and myself. "Leave me alone," I said, trying to sound firm. One of the boys stepped forward, smirking. "We just want to talk, really. We know what you did." "What I did?" I felt my heart drop. "I don't even know you." They advanced a few steps, and I stepped back instinctively, my mind racing. I had to find a way out of this situation. I looked for another path, but the layout of the park was disorienting in the dark. I took a few steps back, thinking maybe I could make it to the parking lot where my car was. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, and saw it was just a dad picking up his child from the playground. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Hey, you all right?" he asked, noticing the tension in my body. "Not really." I began, but then the group of teenagers shifted, moving closer. The dad noticed, his expression changing. "You need to leave him alone," he said firmly, stepping in front of me. The teenagers paused, exchanging uncertain glances. "We were just talking to him," the girl replied, but I could see the intimidation flickering in her eyes. "Whatever you think you are doing, it is not okay." "Back off," he said, and I felt a surge of gratitude. The group hesitated, and for a moment, I thought they might retreat. But then the boy who had spoken earlier laughed, trying to appear nonchalant. "We were just having some fun." The dad didn't back down. "Not here. Leave. Now." With one last glare at me, they turned and began to walk away, whispering among themselves. I could not shake the sense of relief and disbelief. They were really just leaving? Once they were far enough away, I took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly leave my body. The dad turned to me, concern still etched on his face. You okay? Do you want me to walk you to your car? I nodded, grateful for the offer. Yes, please. I'm not sure why they were following me. I have never seen them before. He kept a protective stance as we walked, and I felt safer with him nearby. People can be strange, he said, shaking his head. You did the right thing by not engaging with them. Max stayed close, and I felt a surge of affection for my dog. He had sensed the danger, and I realized how much I relied on him. We reached my car, and I quickly unlocked the door. The dad stood by, ensuring I got in safely. If you see them again or feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call the police, he said. Thank you, I replied, feeling the weight of the encounter finally lift. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty park behind me. I drove home, reflecting on how quickly things could escalate. The park, once a safe haven, had turned into a scene of intimidation. I vowed to stay alert and to trust my instincts. I had learned a hard lesson about being cautious, and I would not forget it anytime soon. Max curled up in the passenger seat, and as I drove into the night, I felt a renewed sense of vigilance. I would not let fear control my life.